The influence the Diablo series has exerted on video games as a medium, and specifically ARPGs, is extremely far-reaching. Diablo has gone as far as to reach out of the video game sphere and into people's lives like few franchises have been able to. The Cow Level, The Butcher, and Deckard Caden's famous line, "Stay a while and listen," all evoke profound feelings of comfort and joy in people who have enjoyed the different games at the different points in their lives. However, with each new release, what Diablo is has been less and less concrete to a fragmented fan base. Diablo as a series has vastly changed since its release in 1996, each installment and expansion bringing in new fans while occasionally alienating others. Diablo as a series has touched the lives of millions and means so many things to so many different people. What it means to each individual is heavily dependent on what game they played, when, and with who. Diablo is so much more than any individual installment. Diablo has history, not only with itself, but with gaming as a whole. And I want to look at that history and find out what Diablo is. I want to truly look at the different motivations behind the different developers who worked on these games, and what each new installment gained or lost along the way. I want to talk about the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. The core pillars each game stood upon, and where each installment improved, as well as where they diverged from the previous installment. If you're a longtime fan, this might be a trip down memory lane. If you've only ever played Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls or Diablo Immortal, this might be an interesting look into the history of the games you've never played. This breakdown isn't a tier list of the games, and it's not meant to say any one game is better than another. I didn't sit down here to complain what went wrong and how it was different back in my day, like a great-grandfather on his porch polishing his shotgun. I'm an avid fan of the series, and I personally like each installment, even if I don't like everything about each installment. I spent my childhood in my friend's backyard, the three of us vanquishing the imaginary demons until we confronted Baal, and would always get so close to beating him until his twin brother would come out and hit us with the double Baal attack. That's why I made this video. I want to look deep into the soul of the Diablo series and find out what it is I'll see. I'm not going to be blaming anyone for anything, and instead I'm going to try and be as fair and informative as possible, so that anyone who has ever liked Diablo for any reason will still be able to see that version of the game somewhere along the way. With that said, this video will be broken up into the major releases of the game, and there's no better place to start than at the beginning. The original Diablo game was released on New Year's Eve 1996 and is considered a masterpiece by many people today. However, before its release, many publishers who were pitched on the idea of the game thought it would be anything but. This is because RPGs as a genre weren't selling well at all at the time. Blizzard North, or Condor as they were called then, had great trouble procuring financial backing for the game because publishers weren't willing to risk money to finance a game they knew wouldn't sell. So Condor had no choice but to keep trying, waiting for their big break, not knowing if it would ever come. It took almost a decade, but that break would finally come to them when they met a team through interesting circumstances called Silicon and Synapse. Both Condor and SNS had worked on a port for the Justice League Task Force game. During their time working on that game, SNS had been developing a PC game. The developers of Condor had asked if they could pitch Diablo to SNS, but SNS wanted to finish their game first before looking over Condor's game. Later, SNS changed their name to Blizzard and released the game they had been working on called Warcraft. They would then head up to Condor's office to look over the Diablo's concept and design document. As a company of people who loved games, Blizzard saw so much more there than any of the publishers who had seen it before. They knew they had to finance it. While many RPG sales were seen barely as a drop in a bucket, Diablo sales would kick the bucket over and go on to be one of the best-selling RPGs of its time. It went on to sell almost 1 million copies for its first year. For reference of scale, Warcraft sold only 1/10 the amount of units in the same span of time, but was considered a huge win. Diablo didn't achieve this level of success by copying any other game's formula and tweaking it just slightly. Instead, its approach to fantasy was seen as a foil to the standard at the time. The developers even described Diablo while they were working on it as the antithesis of RPGs, and I would even say its existence was derailed from the current track of video games in general. During a time when the best-selling games in America were lighthearted and colorful Nintendo games like Mario and Donkey Kong, Diablo dared to be a muted, gritty, and gothic world with a foreboding atmosphere that wasn't cute or filled with rainbows, but instead colored red and black with blood and despair. While Diablo is tonally dark and foreboding, that doesn't diminish the sense of wonder and enjoyment players will have stepping into the world for the first time. The game was surprisingly fun and enjoyable in a lighthearted way, even though death and demons are constantly surrounding the player. From character creation to credits, Diablo is a satisfying and enjoyable hack-and-slash dungeon crawler. Something you often hear when recommended games from Diablo's time period is that it will get interesting or fun after some amount of hours. You just need to stick with it until it's fun. You won't hear that about Diablo. It is fast-paced fun that lets you hit the ground running, and this is exemplified in the first 5 seconds you will have with this game. It allows you to get into the action with nothing more than a handful of clicks. It was a welcome contrast to most RPGs where you have detailed character creations with attribute points to increase your character's stats, skill points to acquire skills, and in-depth appearance modifiers to make your characters look exactly like you want. These RPGs do this to give you more agency with the experience, but Diablo says, fuck that noise. We're just here to party. The developers felt it would take too long for players to make decisions they weren't really ready to make yet. And while the idea of grabbing class with predefined stats seems common today, it was such a new idea to the RPG genre at the time, the developers actually attributed a sports game with inspiring them to go with the system they did for starting a new game. NHL 95 was very popular at the time and a favorite game around the Diablo developers' office. They loved how it was only a couple of button clicks before you were already skating on the ice, shoving your skate into someone's skull. The instant action they felt from NHL 95 was something they knew they wanted Diablo to have. Every time you want to start a new character, it's just clickety, click, click, character name, and click, you're in. This change would end up helping people unfamiliar with RPG games more than anyone would realize. I would even go as far as to say the fast action behind this character creation is the first core pillar of the game. This character creation was very new at the time and did many things to help Diablo excel into the public space. In many RPGs, if you aren't familiar with their systems, you will have a difficult time playing. A lot of RPG fans persevere instead of remake their character because that's part of the experience. But even if you've made game-breaking mistakes, you won't want to recreate your character because of the initial time commitment. It's hard to differentiate a good game you completely botched up the leveling of and a bad game with terrible balancing. It leads to some people having a terrible experience in the early game and quitting. Because let's face it, there's a lot of unbalanced games. However, in Diablo, the same amount of time it took a player to make one character in another RPG, you can clear the first floor of the cathedral with 2 or 3 different classes and maybe even give a cow a couple of pets. That's right, good cow. Yeah.
I'm no milkmaid.
Diablo doesn't lose any of the customizability that most RPGs strive for with their front-loaded character creation either, because Diablo had created its own unique character building experience. Every time you level in Diablo, you get 5 attribute points. You could use these to increase your character's 4 different attributes. This is a huge departure from the Dungeons & Dragons style leveling that RPGs of the time had adopted. In actual Dungeons & Dragons, you roll 3 6-sided dice 6 times to get 6 different numbers between 3 and 18. To make it easy to understand, let's say you get 1 18 and 1 3 and 4 10s. You then use these 6 numbers to fill in the 6 attributes of your character. So if you're a warrior, you would probably put the 18 in strength, and then the 3 in intellect or wisdom. There would be gear that could moderately raise these scores later in the session, but they were usually really overpowered and rare. You can get more attributes while leveling, but you can only get a total of about 10 when you reach max level of 20. A level 1 warrior in Diablo, on the other hand, has 30 strength, 10 magic, 20 dexterity, and 25 vitality at level 1, and gets 5 more attributes every single level. If I lost you because you're the kind of person whose eyes glaze over whenever someone talks numbers, the short version, which I should have started with, is a level 20 warrior in Diablo will likely have 3 times the amount of attribute points that a Dungeons & Dragons warrior will. More than that, though, a D&D character has nearly 90% of his stats already at level 1, whereas a Diablo warrior only has about 30% of his stats at level 1. and the player didn't have to choose any of them. They were given to him by the developers, so it feels more like Diablo character stats come from progression instead of creation. With 3 times the amount of stats as D&D, it feels like 3 times the amount of wiggle room, as Diablo's leveling doesn't only give a sense of customizability, it gives a sense of forgiveness. As a warrior, you can put your first 5 levels into magic, realize it was a mistake, and from then on, put your points into everything else that matters. By the time you reach the final boss, you won't be any worse for wear, and may even have some strong spells to help you that you wouldn't have otherwise. In fact, Diablo gives its classes so much freedom that you don't even have to stop putting points into magic as a warrior. While a warrior isn't 1-to-1 as strong as a sorcerer in magic, he could still be a magic wielder. If in your mind your warrior realizes magic is stronger than his sword along the way, he doesn't have to wait to be reincarnated to use that knowledge. He can start using spells right away with enough magic, and this increases the sense of immersion and fun by letting every class act as every other class if the player wants them to. Your mage can wear plate armor, your warrior can use a staff, nothing is off limits. While this opens up interesting playthroughs, the class freedom also leads to extremely weak class definition. The lines between mage, ranger, and warrior are blurred to the point where these classes are almost purely cosmetic, and I think the class system suffers because of it. The biggest difference between the classes, other than their look, are their starting stats, and the fact that each class has a slight stat modifier to what they're good at, as well as different skill caps for their skills. These caps mean that even though you have freedom to do whatever you want, you still have the ability to make a character nearly unusable if you're not careful. While the character system was revolutionary for its time and is still a very enjoyable experience today, Diablo is not without its weaknesses. The Diablo team really didn't have any seasoned writers at the time. Of the 4 writers that wrote for the game, 2 would only ever have writing credentials for Diablo, and the other 2 had limited credentials at the time, only ever having worked on Warcraft 2, a very story-like game. This comes through in the story of Diablo, where it feels very erratic and trips over itself at times. At the beginning, most people who play the game will get confused, as there are 2 conflicting explanations as to what's happening. If you talk to Ogden, the barkeep, you will likely think that dark riders have come through town and taken the villagers into the monastery to perform dark rituals on them, and you should go in and try and save them. He gives a speech, and this is more or less what you can draw from what he says. This is not the case though, and you will find out that almost immediately. But I think this is the start of a different rendition of the storyline. Now, in the manual, there is a reference to Dark Riders, but I think that's something that was used to explain what's happening after the fact, but more on that later. The very first quest giver you meet is a dying man cut apart by the butcher, asking you to avenge his friends. He says that the archbishop came into town to rile up the townsfolk to go in and find the missing prince, which he believes to be inside the cathedral. This contradicts not only what Ogden said, but also contradicts the existence of one of the characters in the game, Farnham. Farnham was apparently a part of the original party that went into the monastery and suffers from terrible PTSD from the experience, only coping through the use of the bottle. It makes no sense that the quest giver would just now be escaping if he had been a part of this expedition, as we never see another living human inside the cathedral. What does make sense though is if the butcher was originally designed to be one of the Dark Riders. This is what the quest giver said in the original alpha for the game.
Please help. I barely escaped from the butcher. He killed my wife, my children. I beg of you, in the name of God, avenge them.
This coincides nicely with what Ogden said about the Dark Riders. What this means is the first time anyone ever comes into contact with Diablo's story, they get a broken narrative. Most of the story lines up with the Archbishop narrative, and you can ignore the Dark Rider narrative, but it's clear there is a contradicting storyline that they just did not have the time to reconcile. If you think I'm being harsh or I'm flat out wrong, you likely think this because the story is explained better in the manual. The manual explains the Dark Rider storyline, the Archbishop story. However, I know for a fact the manual story was written after. That's because of the end of the game. Spoilers if you haven't played it. Actually, spoilers for everything. Fuck you. At the end of Diablo, you kill Diablo, only to find out the prince has been possessed by Diablo the whole time via a soul stone. The hero then takes the soul stone, puts it into his forehead in order to contain Diablo's essence, so Diablo cannot run rampant. The team creating Diablo did not make this decision. The cinematic team made this dependent of the Diablo creators and writers' wishes. This was not how the game was supposed to end. That's not to say it was bad. They actually liked the ending a lot, but it wasn't the one they were setting up in the storyline they were actively putting into the game via dialogue and quests. This was late into the project, so they changed as much of the game as they could, but if you read the manual, it describes the Soul Stone as being able to contain Diablo's essence as long as a human host is used. This had to be added after this cutscene was done, so I can surmise that the story written in the manual was written after the game, not before. While this is a weakness, the story was never a priority for the Diablo team. That doesn't excuse confusing the players at the beginning, but there was a part of the game that relates to the story that they wanted to do well, and they did. They wanted memorable and enjoyable characters, and the characters of Diablo are amazing. Without the developers forcing the characters to be a mouthpiece to push forward the plot, each character could really stand out and feel real. They all feel like there's so much more to them than what you get, and in turn, it makes the game feel more expansive than it is. Cain takes on the role of the wise old man, but less of a father figure and more of a good friend. I still quote his iconic "stay a while and listen" every chance I get, and with the way the quest system is set up, his role as an elder actually feels real. The quest system is set up so that anytime you meet a new NPC in the cathedral or come across a unique item, you gain an entry in your quest log. You can then ask everyone in town about it. Most of the town will be at a loss, or give obviously flawed information about what you're asking about. I mean, what does Pippin know about an anvil of blood forged in the depths of hell? He's a healer. Cain, on the other hand, has a deep knowledge of the world based on the texts he's read over his life. So all of the player's knowledge of the dark side of the world comes directly out of Cain's mouth. This knowledge is also reinforced through the identification system. Items will drop and have special properties on them, but you won't know what they are unless you use a magic scroll of identification to give you that knowledge. Cain, on the other hand, can tell you exactly what the item's properties are at a glance. Cain is far from the only interesting character as well. Wirt was abducted as a child and tortured by demons. He was saved by Griswold the blacksmith during the original expedition into the cathedral. Wirt's personality has been warped a bit due to this situation and his lack of any paternal figures, but his gratitude shows through for Griswold because he's the only character he has anything good to say about. He is famous among players as being an incredibly expensive merchant. He does, however, have a soft spot for Gillian the barmaid, as a boy his age might. Gillian herself is a beautiful girl, but she has little to add from a professional standpoint. But even she has history. She grew up in Tristram and worked at a bar most of her life. So whether it's words from a traveler's loose lips trying to show off after drinking too much, or the stories from the people who have lived around the town over the years, you can't say she has nothing to offer. Farnham, Pippin, Ogden, Ardria all have something to add to the feeling of the life in the overworld. Where games tend to suffer from unrealistic characters and often sacrifice realistic interactions in order to move along plot, Diablo does none of that and treats its characters like people. You get to know and appreciate each of the characters as you learn more about their life. This is further reinforced with the game's settings. At first, the game feels so tiny and constricting with only 7 NPCs in a single town that only has a cathedral with a dungeon in it. The world feels so much more real because of it. Townsfolk in the middle of nowhere who are having a terrible thing happen to them, sick grandmothers, PTSD-stricken drunks. Each character has tangible meaning to the experience. Instead of spreading themselves out too thin and making the dungeons smaller and adding them across a larger land to make the game feel bigger, they made story that feels like it could happen anywhere, with characters that it feels like it's happening to. So while the story isn't the strongest part of the game, the characters really make up for it. This makes them a core pillar of the experience. With all that said, the characters are only the second best thing about Diablo. The most satisfying thing about the game is the gameplay. Every time you step into the cathedral, you are in for an amazing time. Every aspect of the experience is exhilarating and feels like it's been masterfully crafted to ensure you have as good of a time as humanly possible. Skeletons, zombies, demons. When you first step into the dungeon, you are proverbial wrecking ball. as you plow through the different creatures infesting the cathedral. Your character may be level 1 in Diablo, but he's supposed to be a seasoned veteran, and it shows. There's nothing quite like the feeling of running through a horde of demons and cleaving limb from limb until you are surrounded by a mountain of corpses and loot. But while you're cleaving through the demons like some kind of archangel of fury, you'll do well to remember that you are not unbeatable. Your first real fight will come from the Butcher, and in fact, he's the only real difficult enemy for a while. He's surrounded by gored townspeople when you walk in on him, and when he sees you, all he has to say is his iconic line, "Fresh meat." It actually feels like he was made way too difficult for when you fight him, because it's likely the first place you'll die, and the last time you'll die for quite a while. But the encounter with him will show you that making sure you're prepared by filling up your potions and maybe having some extra magic candy can make a difficult fight much easier. In fact, you have 8 total slots for potions and scrolls on your hotbar, and while there's still one on there, you're virtually unstoppable. If you're surrounded when you've used up the last one, you're likely headed straight to a game over screen. It's actually amazing how the hotbar feels like a real belt of potions, because if you run out, you can only drink more by opening up your inventory and grabbing the potion you want. This moment feels like you're an adventurer fighting for his life while rummaging around inside your bag looking for that thing that's going to save your life. As you get deeper into the cathedral, though, your hotbar will get emptier much more frequently as the danger you're in increases. The surroundings begin to reflect the increasing danger of your foes. While you're getting stronger, so are the minions of hell. Where you were originally cleaving through enemies left and right, it's now safest to bring your enemies to a doorway to funnel them in and fight them one by one. You can prepare an escape on the other side of a doorway, having a town portal ready. Instead of rummaging through your bag, you can drop the potions on the ground around you so it's easier to pick up and use them. However, no matter how good you get, the enemies are getting stronger at a faster rate than you are. Once you get to hell, you'll realize it looks a lot like the Butcher's Den of Gore. I said it felt like he was a bit too strong for when you fight him, and it feels like it's because this is where he may have came from. While your character was already a seasoned adventurer before the start of the game, it starts to sink in why so many seasoned adventurers have never come back from the cathedral. You're significantly stronger than when you first set foot in here, but you are brought to the brink of death time and time again. The sound design makes this even more real. Hidden in the background are people making unsettling noises. It feels like the souls of the damned and departed that lost their lives here. No one ever sees the demons you have fought. There's no local lord to give you accolades each time you vanquish a powerful foe, and why would there be? You know better than anyone on the surface that for each powerful enemy you vanquish, there's a horde of stronger enemies just beneath your feet. All that you have is yourself and the mission. No one has been this far, and if you perish, the demons will reclaim the ground you've taken, and likely no one will get this far again. What makes this even more amazing is the equipment you get along the way. This constant sense of dread isn't overwhelming because there's always better loot to be had that can help you even the playing field. Fighting a new and difficult foe on a lower floor and receiving a new and more powerful weapon that turns every other monster like the one you just killed into a minor annoyance is extremely satisfying. Gear in Diablo is like a light in the darkness, and this is exactly what it was designed to be. This sound is the sound of a ring dropping. It's high-pitched and extremely noticeable over the muted setting and eerie music of the game. It cuts through the darkness. It feels like a gift from the heavens, and a gift from heaven while you're literally traversing hell is quite satisfying. This is by design. One of the main reasons they had to make such a muted setting to begin with is so that loot could be that much more satisfying to get. The feeling of filling up your limited inventory with unidentified and rare items to go back up, shift through your plunder felt great. Whether it was getting lucky by finding something worth buying from Wirt, having an incredibly powerful roll on a piece of gear from the dungeon, or Griswold having a nice upgrade in his shop, the loot is a major reason people love Diablo, making it earn the title of the final core pillar of the game. With all of your powerful loot, you will eventually reach the bottom of the cathedral and face Diablo himself. He is definitely the coolest of the bosses, and he's really, really strong. Fighting him in an epic battle feels like a culmination of all of the tricks you've learned up until now. Once you defeat him, his flesh melts away into the corpse of a prince, and your character realizes what must be done. You sacrifice yourself to contain him, and that's the end of Diablo, kind of. Diablo has 3 difficulties: normal, nightmare, and hell. Unlike other games with higher difficulties, they aren't meant to propose a challenge. They are meant to continue the game. You would be a fool to challenge nightmare mode before completing normal mode, because the enemies are all more powerful than any enemies on normal. These difficulties don't unlock when you complete a playthrough though. You need to play online in order to access them. And while there is more to this game when you're fighting on harder difficulties, I'm going to have to ignore it. While playing Diablo online with a party of friends is as fun, if not more so, than regular Diablo, Diablo had a real problem with online. So most people were never able to experience the harder difficulties, and if they did, it was a terrible experience. So that's why I'm going to skip over the higher difficulties. The issue Diablo 1 had was hackers. The hacks in Diablo ranged from making completely overpowered characters to completely destroying an innocent person's save, as in a hacker would join someone's game while they were in it, and the regular guy's save would become completely corrupted. This was a real issue with Diablo at the time, as the only way to challenge these higher difficulties was to play online, and doing so would risk the save of your character you had spent days, if not weeks, to make. It was a real issue and would be one of the driving factors when making Diablo 2. It's possible, though, to play harder difficulties in Diablo now, because the difficulties would eventually be selectable in single player when the Hellfire expansion came out. While almost all of my recent playthroughs on Diablo have been on Hellfire, that's because of 2 important things. The first is that there's a jog feature in town that lets you move much faster, and since frequent trips to Tristram are necessary, it saves tons of time. The second is just being able to select difficulties in single player. If you know nothing about Hellfire expansion, you might hear this and be confused about these features I just talked about. You may wonder if that's all that was included in the expansion, but it's not. The expansion added a few quests, a new class, a few skills, and an 8-floor dungeon. The issue is that these additions spit in the face of everything I've said up until this point. The tone of these quests are completely off. The dungeons are nothing like the original. I'm not exaggerating either. The developers of Diablo didn't work on Hellfire expansion and never wanted it to happen in the first place. A separate team called Synergistic Software worked on the expansion and ignored every request from the Diablo developers they got. It got to the point where the original developers put their foot down and told Blizzard not to release it, but it got released. If rumors are to be believed, Hellfire saw most, if not all, of the team that worked on it fired because of it. I have never played the additional Hellfire content, and I likely never will. The reason for this is because a bad experience contained a good one, and just the knowledge of how angry the devs got in any interview they have over 20 years later being asked about Hellfire lets me know that I'm just better off playing a new character rather than going into the side content.
What is the story with the Hellfire expansion?
Oh my god, really? You're gonna bring that up?
While Hellfire may have officially been a stain on the Diablo franchise, it cannot be understated how amazing an experience the first Diablo was. Its 3 core pillars helped it stand up against the terrible sales of the genre for its time. The wonderful instant action, the satisfying loot system, and the memorable characters of Tristram. Diablo had taken the idea that had stopped publishers from funding it, that RPGs are a dead genre and no longer sell well, and spit in its face. The game went on to sell 2.5 million copies, and the only reason it didn't sell more is because a game that most people think completely eclipsed it came out 4.5 years later, Diablo 2. With the success of Diablo, Blizzard North had no reason to venture away from their pre-established norms. It would have been easy for their team to phone in the creation of Diablo 2 and just give us Diablo 1 again with some new features in a new location. But that's not what happened. The first Diablo was conceptualized by a high schooler who had a dream of making video games. It came about through the power of persistence and determination of not only him, but of a lot of like-minded individuals. Diablo 2 wasn't just a sequel to Diablo 1, it was the evolution of these people's dream to make the best game that's ever been made. The team had decided early on that Diablo 2 wasn't just meant to fix the issues with Diablo 1. It wasn't Diablo 1 with a new coat of paint. It was meant to be the bigger, better Diablo game. More classes, more characters, more areas, more loot, and most importantly of all, more fun. The lead of Diablo 2 team had a saying he had used to completely axe other games in development.
And I said, I don't want to be kind of the GM of video games. I want to be the Ferrari of video games.
Yeah.
And so, is this a Ferrari?
Before I go on to actually talk about the game, I want you to know that I'm making a decision to specifically talk about Diablo 2 combined with its Lord of Destruction expansion. I may mention differences between Lord of Destruction and Diablo 2 specifically when applicable, but Lord of Destruction was released less than a year after the original Diablo 2. It came with 2 extra classes, a whole extra act, and many of the features attributed to Diablo 2, like rune words, that the game is remembered for today. While I think there is a good reason to look at what changed between 2 and Lord of Destruction, I don't think this is the place to do it. Diablo 2 was behind schedule and had to make cuts to the original conceptual release of the game in order to release on time, including a whole act, and I would agree Lord of Destruction is the game Diablo 2 should have been on release, as both base Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction were created by the same team and having had virtually every person from Diablo 1's creation inside of both. With that being said, the game has very noticeable differences from the start. While the original Diablo story was extremely fragmented, feeling almost like an afterthought, Diablo 2's is much more involved in the player experience. When the original Diablo released, Blizzard had only released 2 other games, Warcraft 1 and 2, which were both gameplay heavy and story light. However, 2 years after Diablo's original release, Blizzard had released another brand new IP, StarCraft. StarCraft may have been similar to Warcraft in its real-time strategy gameplay, but it was Blizzard's first truly engaging story. 3 separate campaigns delving into intergalactic politics, a heavy helping of sci-fi fantasy with just a touch of redneck hillbilly. It was truly the best story to come out of Blizzard up to this point, and even though Diablo had been out for a couple of years and Warcraft had seen 2 installments, StarCraft was the first game from Blizzard that warranted a novel written to expand its universe. What does StarCraft's story have to do with Diablo 2? Well, it's not uncommon that advancements in one publisher's IP mean those same advancements in different existing properties, especially if the publisher utilizes their different teams to help one another, and Blizzard did. In the Diablo section, I talked about writers who were on Diablo, half of which only ever worked on Diablo their entire career, and the other half had a minuscule amount of experience on Warcraft 2. Diablo 2 saw one of those 2 writers come back to work on the new installment of Diablo, after being one of the lead writers for StarCraft. So the person who helped create the extremely high quality story for Blizzard's most recent property would be at the reins steering the story for a new Diablo game, and it was gonna be a wild ride. The first thing you see when starting Diablo 2 up is an opening cinematic. You meet a broken man named Marius who is rotting away in what seems to be a prison cell as he is met by a cloaked figure who he believes to be Tyrael, an angel from the heavens. Tyrael wants to know what happened to Marius to bring him here, and Marius begins recounting what happened in his life that led him to the cell he's in now. The beginning of the story takes place shortly after the end of the original Diablo, where he meets a wanderer who had been haunting his dreams. Shortly after the wanderer arrived, Marius recounts how the wanderer seemingly inadvertently summoned forth a terror of demons that massacred the town that he was staying in. The only 2 left alive were Marius and the wanderer. The wanderer then stands up and leaves the inn, and compelled by some dark compulsion, Marius followed. This cutscene is about 7 minutes long and immediately shows the difference in quality between the game and its predecessor. We are introduced to 3 seemingly completely unknown characters, a broken man interrogated by an angel about his journey with a demon. It's an opening that leaves a sense of wonder and longing to know more. This opening stands stands in stark contrast to the opening of the original game. Comparing it to the original, the conflicting statements from Ogden and the dying villager that start off your journey pales in comparison to the way this cutscene begins your journey. In 2, we start off with a very clear understanding of the events that have happened and a good idea of what is to come. Overall, the quality and scale of the storytelling has gone up immensely. However, these improvements have come at a cost. With the quality of the story rising, the quality of the characters fell. There are no returning characters from Diablo 1 except the Wanderer, now possessed by Diablo and Deckard Cain. All of the characters from the first game are presumed dead. The story will eventually go through Tristram, where we see unnamed corpses where several villagers used to stand, as well as one named corpse and a zombie of Oswald you will fight. I think this turn of events is not only understandable, but also extremely likely from a story perspective. Diablo would be vengeful for what happened in Tristram, and when he came back to life, he would want to make everyone who had lived there suffer. There's nothing inherently wrong with killing off the original cast, but their death means they couldn't be used to help introduce new characters or add depth due to the work done in the first game. I've already gone into detail about how strong the characters from the first game are, but I want to say it again that the small scale of the first game let the cast shine in their own individual ways. The 7 characters grew up in the same town, and each had a realness to them that is difficult to replicate in a large-scale game, and that's exactly why the characters are lacking in the sequel. In Diablo 2, there are about 30 NPCs, and with the exception of Cain, Tyrael, and Marius, they all come off as fairly one-dimensional. Each act has its own characters, and you can interact with them the same way you could in the first game. After each and every quest, you'll be able to talk to almost every NPC in the act the quest takes place in. This, in and of itself, isn't what made the characters from 1 so good, though. It was their history in the town of Tristram, paired with the reactivity they had to everything that went on in the game that made them feel so real. Each act takes place in a different location, so you only ever bring Cain and at most the person who transported you from one location to the next. So instead of one small town packed to the brim with history, you have 5 different locations that were created to serve as catalysts for plot to occur. This means characters were created to serve a purpose as opposed to naturally existing where you find them. Of the 30 characters, there are 2 that are literally just there to make sure you don't progress too early. This rogue and this literal angel are just here to tell you that you should do certain quests before moving on. Now, there are many examples of many games that have done this, because characters like this can be a useful tool for the devs to help you go the desired way, but we're not talking about those games. We're talking about the sequel to a game that had characters as a core pillar of the experience. Whereas Oswald was the town blacksmith raised by his father, a blacksmith, serving as a warrior in the king's army and saving a boy from the depths of hell. You now get a blacksmith in each town because obviously the player needs a way to repair their armor, and they're given backstory so that the fact that they exist is less immersion breaking, well, most of the time. The Act 4 blacksmith has no dialogue and is literally just there so that you have a repair station. So they literally ran out of ways to make blacksmiths have character. There's also one-to-one copy of characters from the first game that just don't have the same depth. There's a town drunk in Act 2, and this is just a town drunk. There's no expanding on why he drinks, he just does. And I think that sums up all the characters, really. Why do they do what they do? Because they do. If the devs needed the player to know something and they couldn't figure out how or why an existing character would know the information they wanted to give you, they would just make a new character who already had the knowledge they were going for. This isn't the only trade-off Diablo 2 made either. The playable classes were much more unique now than they were before. Class freedom was a tenet in Diablo 1, but in 2, they decided that there were negatives of class freedom they had initially implemented that outweighed the benefits. While progressing through the cathedral was very tangible, the character progression of 1 was much less noticeable. Like I said, you go from massacring enemies on the first floor of the cathedral to having to funnel enemies through a doorway. It's hard to feel like your character is actually actually moving along and progressing when you were just getting weaker and weaker in comparison to the enemies. This aspect was massively improved upon in 2. You still had 4 basic attributes, receiving 5 attribute points per level, just like in the first game. But these weren't the only thing characters received on level up. You could also receive skill points to put into skills. Characters no longer had to learn spells from finding grimoires in the dungeon. Instead, every time you received a skill point, you could use it to either learn a new skill or increase the power of an existing skill. While in the original, the spells you could learn were limited by what you found in your run as well as the magic attribute level of your character, Diablo 2 would take a much more progress-based approach. Diablo 2 implemented skill trees, and in these skill trees, you'd have about 10 skills per tree. Once you unlock a skill, you could then pump as many points into it as you want, up to 20, but there are 2 different requirements to unlocking a skill. The first is a level requirement. Your initial skills are able to unlock as soon as you start the game. But then there's a level gate every 6 levels up until level 30, when you unlock the final skills for your class. The second is a previous skill requirement. All except for the most basic skills require 1 or 2 previous skills to be learned before you can put any points into them. The class diversity the system presents is the first core pillar of Diablo 2. Even before Lord of Destruction, you had 5 classes, each with 3 different skill trees with a total of 150 skills. Once Lord of Destruction came out, it added 2 more classes or 60 more skills. You could argue that taking away every class's ability to be every other class has limited the freedom of the game, and I would agree with that. However, I think there's a lot of freedom inside of each class. It's just set up to be a more focused freedom. You can receive 98 skill points from leveling, and you can allocate them to whatever skills you want, where each skill can have a maximum of 20 base skill points. The amount of different builds you can have is staggering. In order to tell you exactly how many different builds you can have, I wrote some software to count each and every build. You can have too many. I originally wrote this software pretty slow, and there was literally no way it was going to finish within the next 10 years or so. So I spent a day fine-tuning it and finally decided it would take me over a week to get the software fast enough that it would actually finish so that I could include it in this video. I ended up just running it for a total number of different builds a Necromancer could have at level 31. After running it for 24 hours, my program let me know that a level 31 Necromancer could have way too many fucking builds. I still couldn't get it to finish, and I knew it wasn't going to finish for a very long time. At the speed in which it was going, it looked like it would take a month to finish just for level 31. This doesn't include gear attributes or quest skill points. It only includes skill points you get from leveling. So it's likely the reason my program couldn't finish is because there are more builds for a Necromancer at level 99 than there are known atoms in the universe. So while Diablo 1 allowed any class to learn any spell, the diversity of a single character pales in comparison to the class diversity in Diablo 2. Now, that's not to say all builds are created equal. In fact, I would venture a guess that only 99% of all builds would be viable when you reach Hell difficulty, and without the right gear, even a good build would be useless. This is something the developers were hoping to avoid with the class system of Diablo 2, as it was an issue as well in Diablo 1, but I would say that the issue of terrible builds is worse in Diablo 2 than it was in 1. While in Diablo 1 you only had 4 attributes to deal with, in 2 it's far too easy to spread yourself too thin because you want to try out every skill. But as soon as you hit Nightmare difficulty, being a jack of trades makes you a master of none. Some of you might say, but Angel, damn, there's a lot of funk on that. But Angel, how can you say it's worse than 1 and 2 if there are respecs in the game? And you're right, there are, and that's a valid question. I don't know why you had to put so much stank on it at the beginning. There is 1 free respec every single game, potentially infinite respecs if you can kill all bosses on Hell difficulty. But this change didn't ship with the release of D2 Base or Lord of Destruction. The ability to respec is a change that would come to Diablo 2 almost a decade after its release. Diablo 2 released in June of 2000, and patch 1.13, which contained the ability to respec without editing saves, released in March of 2010. Also, this is after a majority of the team who worked on Diablo 2 had already left Blizzard, so I wouldn't say it was necessarily a natural part of the original Diablo 2 experience. However, even with builds that would cause your character to have to be abandoned, the flaws of the system lend themselves to how deep the character creation experience of Diablo is. With 7 different classes, you could play a new character every day with a different build, and with all the gear options you have to choose from, it would be years before the gameplay started to feel samey. Speaking of gear, the loot system would be the only core pillar to continue on from Diablo 1 to Diablo 2. Your character in Diablo 2 can equip all the same gear types that were in Diablo 1. With the addition of boots, gloves, and belts, Diablo had 3 different rarities of gear: basic, premium, and the highest quality, unique. Unique was always the best because they were pieces with predetermined stats. Diablo 1 had a total of 79 unique pieces of gear. Diablo 2, on the other hand, had 5 different rarities: normal, magic, rare, set, and unique. Normal had no stats. Magic had maybe a modifier or 2. Rare was relatively good. Set pieces were about as good as a magic piece on their own, but if you had several set pieces from the same set, they would then be better than even unique pieces due to extra bonuses unlocking. And then you had unique pieces, which, like in Diablo 1, had predetermined stats. There are also 2 new modifiers for these gear: ethereal and socketed, that each piece can have. Ethereal is a piece that cannot be repaired at a smith, but has huge bonuses to its stats, and socketed gear allows you to put things in it like gems, jewels, and runes to make them stronger. Past that, there are also 3 different qualities of each of the gear pieces: normal, exceptional, and elite. The higher the quality, the better the items are, as they are usually for a much higher level character. Depending on who you ask, Diablo 2 has over 500 pieces of gear in the unique category alone, and I haven't even talked about rune words or charms yet. Just the sheer quantity of items there are. The variety at your disposal when gearing up characters dwarfs what there was in Diablo 1. There's a bit of a downside to this though, that getting the gear you want isn't necessarily going to be easy or quick. The Diablo 2 community actually has something of a gauntlet for collecting every unique item in the game. They call it a Holy Grail run. This run consists of the simple task of a single person trying to collect every unique/set piece of the game. I'm not sure how these runs came about, but the fastest speed run anyone has ever completed a Holy Grail is only 438 hours. This is a speed run, and it beats out the next fastest time by 100 hours. That's 18 days worth of hours of play as a speed run, and it took him 52 days to achieve it. So if you're unlucky, it would take you forever to get the pieces you needed. Well, it would if this was Diablo 1. But Diablo 2 has a much better way to get items than Diablo 1 had: online. Diablo 1 had a huge issue with hackers and bad actors all over the online scene, but Diablo 2 was a client-server online experience, which meant that Blizzard could do a better job monitoring Diablo 2's online presence. And while you could never truly get rid of cheaters, the game's online experience was able to thrive to the point where I would say that it was the second core pillar of Diablo 2. Baal runs, Diablo runs, Mephisto runs, Duriel runs, Andy runs, Act 5 boosts, cow level runs, trading, PvP, griefing, laughing, crying, and overall having a great time. Diablo 2 allowed for a more joint online experience than a lot of games were able to accommodate at the time. Just as a frame of reference for an online landscape, other MMOs existed like EverQuest, but fondly remembered online experiences hadn't been released yet. Diablo 2 is 5 years before Clum Penguin, 4 years before Halo 2 or World of Warcraft, a year before RuneScape, and several months before even Counter-Strike was released. Diablo 2 was early to the online scene, and it was definitely a part of the experience for anyone who played during its prime. It's likely the original Diablo would have had a great online scene as well, but it's just for the devs creating the game at the time, online had been an afterthought, and it was only added to the game a few months before release. Diablo 2, on the other hand, was created from the ground up to support the new client-server structure. The devs learned from their mistakes with multiplayer in more ways than one. While multiplayer was connected to the different difficulties in the original, Diablo 2 would only lock its difficulties behind the completion of the final boss of the game. And the difficulties had a lot more depth than the original. While the first game would have stronger enemies, with multipliers affecting the needed armor class and hit modifiers, Diablo 2's different difficulties would have a robust assortment of trials that would complement the class diversity. The difficulties are normal, nightmare, and hell, and like I said earlier, only 99% of builds can compete on hell mode. However, normal will be very manageable for all but the worst builds. Nightmare will see a lot of the worst subpar builds unable to continue with the increased damage and map size. There will be a huge reduction in the player's resistances, each one being lowered by about 40%. The game also becomes much more punishing than it was before. While in normal you would lose a percentage of your gold on death, you now also lose a percentage of your experience on death. This makes getting out of a rut even harder, as dying causes you not to be able to get stronger if you die often enough. Even with all of these modifiers, Nightmare is a breeze in comparison to Hell difficulty. If you look around the forums, there's a common story you'll come across. A player who had no difficulty through normal and Nightmare, but as soon as they take one step into Hell, they can't even complete the first quest. Hell comes with all of the negatives from Nightmare on steroids. 100% resistance reduction, twice as much experience lost on death. The maps are extremely population dense, and there are so many special monsters throughout the entire map. These special monsters are tough, but they aren't the reason Hell is so much harder than Nightmare. Each and every monster has at least one full damage immunity to one of the 5 damage types of the game. If all of your eggs are in one damage basket, there will be a point when you just cannot harm an enemy you come across. Hell is the true challenge of Diablo 2. I talked about the class diversity, loot drops, and online play being the 3 core pillars of Diablo 2, and Hell mode is where all 3 reach their penultimate experience. You will need one of the best builds that has been crafted in order to beat Baal in Hell mode. With hundreds of trillions of builds out there, you'll either have to find one of the standard builds for your class to be able to see him drop, or you'll have to play a new one well enough to add it to the top 99.99th percentile of builds that have ever been created. Player skill and character build alone aren't nearly enough either. You'll need the best of the best pieces of loot to even stand a chance. You'll need magic and rare items with the best possible rolls on their bonuses, set items that complement your build, and most importantly, whatever rune words you can get your grubby little hands on. I mentioned rune words only briefly when talking about loot, but they are the most powerful pieces of gear in the game. When talking about loot, I mentioned that some gear is socketable. Well, if you get normal rarity piece of gear that's socketable, you have a piece of gear that's considered a rune word base. That means it can be turned into a rune word. Rune words are created by getting certain items called runes. These runes normally can be socketed into gear to give it different bonuses, so they can be used for augmenting certain abilities for your gear. But if you have the right runes and you put them in the right order into your rune word base, you can make a god tier piece of equipment. To put it into perspective, this chest piece and this helmet took hundreds of runs through the most optimal way of getting runes in order to obtain them. I likely spent over 100 hours on getting these 2 pieces of gear alone, and I was ungodly lucky to get the burr rune I needed for this chest. For those of you who don't know how lucky I was to see the burr rune, I seriously question even showing this rune word in my video, because a lot of people who see this and know how hard it is to get are going to assume it was given to me. The odds that I got it are something along the lines of 1 in 500,000, because I got it off some zombie boss mob in the Den of Evil as soon as I entered Act 1 of Hell mode. I still needed other runes, hence the hundreds of runs, but this armor was huge for me when going through the rest of Hell mode. Now, this may seem like an insurmountable task. I got lucky with my burr rune, but how could someone possibly farm long enough to get it? Well, that's where the final pillar comes into play. Online. There is a robust trading market in Diablo 2, and if you save up some really nice items to trade, chances are you can get a burr rune. I mean, probably not. I cannot stress just how fucking excited I was to see this rune drop. I played Diablo 2 when I was a lot younger, but I never fucking saw a goddamn burr rune. Like, are you kidding me? Anyway, you really can get a lot. You really can get a lot of high quality items from trading and playing with other people online, though. If you use all 3 of the pillars, you will eventually beat Hell Mode. If you played at release, this would have been the final hurdle for any character, but there was more coming in the horizon with future patches that would contain D-Clone and the Pandemonium event. These events would see more powerful versions of Diablo and other act bosses, commonly referred to as their Uber versions. First, D-Clone would come out in 2003, dropping the Annihilus charm that gave an extra experience boost, skill boost, and resistance up. This item made any build stronger just by having it in your inventory. Finally, one more event would occur in 2004, the final challenge of Diablo 2, the Pandemonium event. This event would see you fight all 5 of the act bosses again in a much harder fight than their original. However, once you complete this was the final challenge of the game. Kind of. When Diablo was first being introduced, it was supposed to be a rogue clone. They even considered getting the rights to use the name Rogue in the title of the original Diablo. The game was supposed to be turn-based and have permadeath, but this never came to pass. However, I think most people would agree that it was for the better. Something Diablo 2 came out with that Diablo 1 didn't was a new character mode. This mode was called Hardcore. There was only one teeny tiny difference between Hardcore and regular, and it goes back to the origins of the game. Permadeath. If you played a hardcore character and they died, your character was gone for good. I've never beaten hardcore on the hardest difficulty, and honestly, I've never tried. But I know the game comes with a much higher set of stakes when playing on hardcore. In hardcore, there's just a different weight to seeing a unique enemy or a group of champions, and your accomplishments hit that much harder. Most people will likely think more highly of a hardcore character beating Bale on normal than a regular character killing the uber bosses. It's not a challenge for all players, but the game takes on a whole different atmosphere when one mistake means your character is gone forever. While defeating Hell is where the core pillars shine their most, just playing the game on hardcore requires you to constantly use each pillar to its absolute maximum. With all that said, I've tried to compile the core pillars of the second game and compare them to the first, and I think I've covered them pretty comprehensively. There is one fundamental aspect I did not cover. Not everyone who played Diablo 1 likes Diablo 2. While I've been breaking down each aspect of the second game when playing 1 and 2 back to back, it's very noticeable how one key aspect of the first game has been completely absent from the second: the heavy and foreboding atmosphere. When you start off Diablo 2, the cutscene is dark and interesting, but besides what's happening to Marius, there really aren't more than a handful of dark aspects to the story. While in the first game you were someone returning to a town where everyone had been slaughtered by evil forces, the second game starts you off in the middle of a caravan. In fact, your reasons for even being there aren't really obvious at all. You hear that the rogues have been displaced from their sanctuary, which is the only way east, and they have no way of reclaiming it. This is a huge tone shift from the first game, where the reason you were plunging deeper and deeper into the cathedral is because the evils inside had destroyed your town, your family, and no one else was up to the task. Unlike the rogue encampment, where you're literally surrounded by capable fighters, Tristram only had you. Also, if you think I'm exaggerating, you will get a mercenary after completing a quest, and with enough potions, they can kill the final boss inside the monastery alone. It's less dark and foreboding and more grand and glorious. You will constantly prove yourself to those around you by doing things it feels like anyone else could do. The most dark and foreboding it gets is when you eventually rescue Cain. All of the characters from the first game are now dead, but even then there is a massive disconnect between the player and their character here. While yes, this can be a moment of despair and sadness for the friends the player has lost, the character you're playing has no connection to this town, and the player might not either if they didn't play 1. It might as well be any other area you fight in the game. There are a bunch of enemies to be vanquished and a quest giver to be saved. There's no emotional weight to this location past what the player brings. You might think I'm being harsh, but any of its lasting effects are diluted to microscopic levels later, because this is the location of a one-time use key to the secret cow level. I don't want to go too deep into this, but the developers still hate to this day that there's a teddy bear quest in Diablo 1's Hellfire expansion, but there's a secret cow level in this game. What's worse is every time you want to go there, you just have to casually pass by the dead bodies of all the NPCs you spent the entire first game getting to know, so you can grab the literal peg leg off of the corpse of a child and your friend Wirt. If the disconnect hasn't hit you yet, I'd like to remind you that the reason Wirt has a peg leg is because he was abducted by demons as a child and was then tortured and had his leg ripped off for fun by the butcher. That's why he had it. And we use it to now just go to a joke level filled with cows saying moo. I personally like Diablo 2 more than Diablo 1, but I can't blame anyone who doesn't like Diablo 2 because of how different the tones are. I've seen so many interviews where David Brevik gets visibly upset when asked about Hellfire, and to expect fans to have a better reaction than he did for virtually the same thing is unreasonable. After saving Cain, he gives you some direction as to what to do, and the game pretty much repeats a similar storyline for each act. Diablo feels more like Moriarty from Sherlock than a demon, because the general sense of the game is that he's always one step ahead of you. No matter how badass you are, you never catch up. In Act 2, you reach Tal Rasha's tomb and Diablo has released Baal. In Act 3, you fail to get to Mephisto before him, Diablo, and Baal all meet up. In Act 4, you chase Diablo instead of Baal. This is when you defeat Diablo. You did it at the cost of sacrificing the World Stone to Baal in Act 5, because when you finally catch up to Baal, you are once again too late. It seems like it would be a hopeless situation, but it never feels hopeless. Your character just can't stop kicking ass. Without fail, every act has several people who doubt your prowess, even with a prime evil count rising. It's just a comical action hero adventure, really. Now, don't get me wrong, I like the story. I like it a lot, in fact. Once again, I'm not saying whether Diablo 2 has a better or worse story than 1. I'm talking about the evolution of it in Diablo. It's clear the tone and atmosphere of 1 had an evolution from a darker, more foreboding tale to a more lighthearted and action-packed adventure. Your character is basically the strongest being on the planet, having fought through a much larger scale set of battles than the original game's protagonist. All in all, while Diablo 1 and 2 share many similarities, there are definitely key differences that make each one unique. The one part that truly helped Diablo 2 stand out and stay relevant for so much longer than Diablo 1 was the online. Through constant patches and seasonal ladders, Diablo 2 was able to stay relevant for over a decade after its release. It's a game that would keep going long after a majority of the people who created it left the company. When it comes to sequels of games, the development cycle usually gives a great deal of insight into what the end result might be like. Even more so for sequels of sequels. You have something like an Assassin's Creed sequel, where very little has changed in any meaningful way. You have the more common kind of sequel, usually 3 to 5 years. Many popular franchises have this kind of cycle, like Pokemon, Uncharted, and Halo. Then there are the dev cycles, where you assume the game has just been canceled. Is usually like 6 to 7 plus years, where the game goes through many teams' hands. Most of the original team has long left the project, and it finally comes out. And if it comes out, it rarely resembles the previous installment. Think Duke Nukem Forever, Final Fantasy 15, and Half-Life 3. Guys, it's coming out. Come on, man. I mean, we got Alex. It has to come out. Diablo 3's dev cycle would last over a decade, change hands 2 times, and would see most of the original developers of Diablo 1 and 2 leave the project well before its completion. The original team, Blizzard North, was disbanded by Blizzard in 2005, 7 years before Diablo 3's release, due to problems with Diablo 3's development. At the time, though, most of the developers on the team had never even seen development on Diablo 2's expansion, so it was only Blizzard North in name, as most people there were recent hires. To put it into perspective, for Diablo 2's development, the distribution of veteran to newbie would be about 1 new developer to every senior developer. The Diablo 2 team was twice as big as the Diablo 1 team, and virtually all of the veterans from Diablo 1 had stayed on for the new installment. Diablo 3's team, however, would be about 20 times bigger than Diablo 2's team, and with all but a handful of the original team leaving the company before Diablo 3's release. The distribution of new and old devs for Diablo 3 on release was roughly 1 to 200 new devs to every dev that worked on Diablo 2. Jesus Christ, man. I didn't know that before looking into it. No fucking wonder Diablo 3 bombed on release. Before you get mad at me because you love Diablo 3, so do I. Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls. But Diablo 3 base did bomb. Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls, however, knocked it out of the park. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In this section, I'm specifically talking about Diablo 3 base. And there are 3 reasons I'm going to spend time talking about it when I intentionally ignored talking about Diablo 2's base. The first is because the same team that released Lord of Destruction also released Diablo 2 base. And while that's also virtually true for Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls and Diablo 3 base, the difference is that the people who made Diablo 3 base had never worked on a Diablo game effectively before this, while the people who worked on Diablo 2 base had a great deal of experience working on a Diablo game before this. So the experience of the people working on the expansion, even though they are the same people, is vastly increased from the people who are working on the base game. So it's very likely Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls was not meant to be a part of the original Diablo 3 experience, unlike Lord of Destruction, where the entire game was leading up to Act 5, but it was cut in order to release sooner. The second reason is Diablo 2 had virtually all the developers that Diablo 1 had, but Diablo 3 had virtually none of those developers. What I mean is the change between the previous installment and the base/expansion is going to be much more drastic going from Diablo 2 to Diablo 3 and then Diablo 2 to Reaper of Souls than it would be to go from Diablo 1 to Diablo 2 and then Diablo 1 to Lord of Destruction, as you can see with this very crude diagram that I made. The final reason is Diablo 2's base was to Diablo 2's expansion what a chocolate chip cookie is to a double chocolate chip cookie. So it's different, but only because you added a little bit more oomph. However, Diablo 3's expansion is to its base what a German chocolate cake is to an oatmeal raisin cookie. Now, it may seem ridiculous to compare these two baked goods, but the oatmeal raisin cookie only has 12 ingredients, and German chocolate cake uses most of them. It adds about 20 more, but it uses most of the original ingredients. It also may leave out oatmeal and raisins, the most notable parts of the oatmeal and raisin cookie, but arguably the worst part. Sorry. My fiance made these white chocolate cinnamon apple pie cookies, and it's got me going into baking soliloquies. Anyway, let's get into it. The changes made during the long production cycle are apparent immediately. The game is no longer 2.5D, and that is actually a substantial departure from the first game for a few reasons. The first is Diablo 2 could have been 3D. The technology existed and it would have actually been less work than the 2.5D they ended up going with. See, they had to create 3D models and then completely render them, and then go on to flatten them into 2D images, and then set up the sprites that way. The reason they didn't is because they wanted Diablo 2 to be timeless. Now, whether Diablo 2's original graphics hold up in your eyes or not is in the eye of the beholder. But the choice the D3 devs made about the graphics was likely made for a very different reason than it was in Diablo 2. Most people think that with a team of over 4,000 people, you could get things done no matter the task. The reality is, there are probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours spent in meetings, discussions, training sessions, and so on. Communication in general, when you have that many people working on the same thing, is a nightmare. The choice to go 3D was very likely made so that bringing in contractors and new hires was as easy as possible, because using common tools they would have used in the past would make it so that anyone who worked on the graphics didn't need to learn a completely new set of steps to make it 2.5D. A lot of decisions would be made for this reason. Since I was talking about baking before, let's continue that trend. Imagine baking a batch of cookies. It might be easier with 2 people in a kitchen. 3 might be pushing it, but it also might be nice if you could send the 3rd to the store if you need it. However, there comes a point when there is just too many people in the kitchen to get any work done. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10, maybe more. but I sure as shit know it's less than 4,000, which was the size of the dev team for Diablo 3. Why does this matter, Angel? Just get to the fucking game already and stop talking about the development cycle. It matters because Diablo 3 has sold over 30 million copies. 10% of those sales came within the first 24 hours of the game's release, and that release was extremely negative. What that tells me is people were expecting something Diablo 3 wasn't going to be. And if you, like me, are one of the 3 million people who bought that game day one, statistically speaking, you hated the game. Now, you may think some of the bad reviews at the time would have been because of internet connection issues, which there was a whole ordeal about. But that's not the reason for its bad Metacritic score. Base Diablo 3 has a 4.2 user score with 10,000 reviews. And using the Wayback Machine, it had only a 4.0 with 5,000 reviews during its launch. They fixed the connection issues within a short time. So the next 5,000 reviews would have been about the base game in its entirety, and the game only went up by a 0.2, meaning overall the base game was not well liked. While there are many aspects to D3 that someone might like or dislike, if you are someone who likes 1 or 2 but dislikes 3, the development cycle of the game is going to be the cause of your frustrations. On the flip side, if you love D3 base but hated 1 and 2, again, the dev cycle is without a doubt what would also be the cause. But whether you love them or hate them, these are the graphics. The second thing you'll run into is the character creation. In holding with the original premise of character creation all the way back to Diablo 1, character creation is still very simple. There was one new addition to character creation, and that's the ability to choose your character's gender. I think it's a small but welcome change. It doesn't unnecessarily bog down the character creation, but it adds a lot to some people's experience. What's more interesting is to look at the change of the classes. There were 5 classes in the base game, and only one of those classes made a return in its entirety from Diablo 2, the Barbarian. One is incredibly similar. The Wizard is very close to the Sorceress. There's also one other kind of return. The Monk was in Diablo 1, but only in the Hellfire expansion. And the final 2, Demon Hunter and Witch Doctor, are brand new to the game series. This being the 3rd installment, this class selection is only our second look into how Diablo handles new characters, and I think it's actually an interesting phenomenon when you think about it. From Diablo 1 to Diablo 2, the warrior became Diablo, the mage becomes the summoner from Act 2, and the rogue becomes Blood Raven from Act 1. Diablo 2 brought in a fresh cast of characters, because the cast from the first game served their purpose, and new classes meant new fun. The only thing that's of note about Diablo 3's classes is that the Barbarian is even there. It shows they were trying to be Diablo more than just being Diablo. What I mean is that Diablo 2 had the original devs, so they weren't learning to create Diablo 2, they just were. A Picasso is always a Picasso. If you want to make another Picasso today, you could only make a Picasso-inspired piece of art, because only Picasso can make a true Picasso. Diablo 3, by the nature of all the devs leaving, can't just be Diablo. It has to try and be Diablo. And I think the fact that the Barbarian was even included is kind of a nod to this reality. This leads me to the first core pillar of the game, and it's not a great one, being a Diablo game. Now, that doesn't sound like an amazing pillar of strength, but nonetheless, I think a great deal of the focus of this game was being a Diablo game. Many artificial nods to the previous game, as opposed to organic evolutions to the Diablo style, were made in this game. Speaking of core pillars, class diversity was a core pillar of the previous game, but I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's a core pillar in this game. That's not because the classes are less diverse than before. In fact, I believe they might even be more diverse. In D2, you had 30 total skills that your class could have. In D3, there are 40 skills broken into 25 abilities and 15 passives. The abilities also have modifiers that change how they act. So instead of having 25 abilities, it's more in the lines that each class has something like 150 abilities. So why isn't class diversity a core pillar then? Well, in Diablo 1 you had access to every spell on each of the 3 classes. All you needed was the magic for it. This actually made the possibilities of your character build limited only by your magic, but made the amount of playstyles you had nearly endless. In Diablo 2, you had billions, if not hundreds of trillions of ways to build any single character. Remember, I'm not talking about gear, I'm not talking about attributes, I'm just talking about skills you could acquire from leveling. Now they did break up the skills, so every class couldn't use every skill, but every class theoretically had access to every one of their skills that they could use anytime that they wanted. That made each class more interesting and more personal to the player. So while they limited skill acquisition, they really explored class capabilities. Even though you had access to all 30 skills whenever you wanted, most people would limit themselves to using between 5 and 15 of them. When I was playing a Necromancer, for example, I had 13 skills I would use regularly. So the reason Diablo 3 isn't considered more free than Diablo 2, even though it has way more skills, about 150 of them, is because you can only ever use 6 of them at any given time. And of the 15 passives, you can only have 3 active. This feels very limiting in comparison to the very free class diversity of the previous game. There are even more limitations made to the character building systems past this as well. The attribute point system is gone now. That means while Diablo 2 had near infinite skill builds, it had even more truly infinite builds because you could allocate your attributes however you wanted. Going from D2 to D3 feels like all class diversity has been completely stripped from the game, and it's noticeable as it was such a main pillar before. At least, that's what it looks like on the surface. While you can't set attributes on level up, gear has attributes on it. So even if you could set your attributes, it would just end up being a bit of flavor on top of the gear system. We'll talk more about gear later. With the implementation of this game, many people thought that Diablo 3 character creation had been dumbed down to be more accessible to newcomers, but I don't think the systems support that theory. Now, I think Diablo 3 is more accessible to newcomers. I don't think the 6 skill structure is a part of that. However, before talking about that, there's also one more reason people think it may have happened that I disagree with. There's a trend among PC games that go to console to get simplified in order to use a controller, since you can no longer count on the usability of a mouse and keyboard. Diablo 3 was the first Diablo to have a simultaneous console release, so that makes some sense. You only have so many buttons on a controller, and therefore you can only do so many things. The problem with this theory is that most of the dumbing down of PC games to console comes from mouse use instead of button layout. Diablo 2 has been released on consoles recently, and I can still use all of my skills when playing there because they use triggers to allow more buttons to be pressed. Games like Final Fantasy XIV have also used combinations of triggers to allow dozens of different skills to be used. So I don't think this is the reason that it happened. There is a reason for this change that makes sense to me, and it leads to the core pillar of Diablo 3, build balance. In Diablo 1 and 2, there was really no concept of balance. There are far superior classes and far weaker classes. Now, the devs didn't make any class unplayable, as every class can reach the endgame, but there was never really an effort to completely balance them. Without a doubt, the Barbarian is the weakest class in Diablo 2, and the Sorcerer or Paladin are the strongest. In Diablo 3, I think this new skill limiting system is set up to help create balance between characters. Since Diablo 2's release, Blizzard's other titles have put a high stress on balanced playstyles, and Diablo 3 was affected by this. Limiting the amount of active skills the player can have at any given time makes balancing each individual skill infinitely easier than allowing the players to use any combination of all of the skills. In fact, I would even say that the average strength and usability of skills in Diablo 3 is higher than it was in any of the previous Diablos, whereas there were many throwaway skills that just didn't make sense to use. So it may feel like the devs are trying to hold your hand hand and make the game easier. But realistically, I feel like there are just less useless skills in Diablo 3, so people want to use more of them. And in order to balance it a bit more, you can't use all of them. Again, that's not to say that there isn't any hand-holding. The game is more accessible to newcomers. Of the 6 skills you can use, they all have their own specific subset of skills that, quote-unquote, should be used in that skill slot. Now, that's not to say that you have to use one skill from each subset of skills. You can attach a different skill to different buttons by checking a box somewhere. But this helps the player not set 6 skills that don't work off of each other at all in each skill slot right off the bat, making it easier for new players. Also, don't let the simplicity of 6 skill slots fool you. The reality is there may not be nearly as many possibilities of builds as there were in Diablo 2, but Diablo 3 still has more for a single class than you could ever play. In Diablo 2, each class had 30 skills. And sometimes getting other skills would power up a different skill in some way. Maybe it was a passive, or maybe the skill just got a percentage increase in the damage for each skill point you put into a different skill. But skills could get stronger without allocating more points to that specific skill. However, in Diablo 3, the skills are broken up differently and have way more interesting changes that can be applied than just base damage increases. As I said before, Diablo 3 skills have a modifier that allows them to change how they work. These modifiers are called runes, and you get them from leveling up. So every single skill has 5 different modifiers, as well as the no rune modifier, meaning each skill can be used in 6 different ways. To talk possibilities, the base Diablo 3 wizard has 25 different skills with 15 different passives. Each skill has 6 different runes, and you can have a total of 6 skills and 3 passives. What does that mean for possibilities? Well, I wrote some code again, and it actually finished this time because there are barely any in comparison to Diablo 2. The final tally of wizard builds comes out to a minuscule 3 trillion. 759 billion.
Billions and billions.
563,808,000 builds. Now, while that may not be nearly as many builds as there were in Diablo 2, if you tried to set up a character to have one build every second, it would take you about 119,215 years to finally equip them all. That's a lot of variety. Now, obviously, not all builds are created equal, but I would venture a guess that with the 6 skill restrictions, even though D3 has a fraction of the possible builds D2 does, that there are more viable builds in Diablo 3's endgame than there are in Diablo 2's endgame. Hence, the class balance I was talking about. The final pillar of the game is story, and it will be obvious right after you select your class. A very high quality cutscene plays, and you're immediately hit with that first pillar I was talking about. Very few things scream Diablo like Deckard Cain, and his voice is the very first thing you hear upon beginning the game. He's talking about the end of days and an upcoming battle between the forces of heaven and hell. He and a new character, Leah, speak to one another in the cutscene. This goes on until Cain is apparently eviscerated by a meteorite, and I have something to say about this opening cutscene. As story is a key pillar of this game, I'm going to need to go more in depth in breaking it down than I did in 1 and 2. This scene is incredibly interesting, but also incredibly odd. There is a lot being said in both verbal and physical communications. For one, it's obvious that Deckard Cain is very, very old. Even in the first game, he wasn't young, but he's basically decrepit, giving off senile grandpa vibes. Leah, who is apparently his niece, and hot, is worried about him and his health. But what's most interesting is that she doesn't seem to believe it's coming. This confounds me. In Diablo 2, it seemed many aspects of what happened a few hundred years ago with the Horadrim were more or less legendary, but it wasn't something people thought was just a myth or had never happened at all. And even if they don't believe it happened, Cain chases the Wanderer with the hero, saving the lives of many people along the way, slaying all 3 primevals in the process. Now, in that game, there were people who didn't believe we actually killed the primevals, but people knew the primevals existed. Even past that, Deckard Cain was known as a scholar. Akara, the high priestess of the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye, knew about Cain before anything bad had happened, and knew him as an extremely intelligent and well-read individual who would be of great use in their efforts to stop the Wanderer. How is it then that Leah, his freaking niece, doesn't believe him? The Wanderer wreaked havoc on multiple cities. Baal rose an army of demons, for God's sakes. Tyrael had just blown up a fucking mountain. It just doesn't feel real to me. It feels like the world isn't what it was in Diablo 2. What this scene reminds me of is Diablo 1's opening storyline, with the two contradicting quest lines. I was actually quite surprised to see that Chris Metzen was the story director, because I don't understand how someone who created Diablo 1 and 2 story could make a world that's just so confused about itself. It's not just one scene either. When this scene ends, you enter the game as whatever class you picked and you do something else new to the series. You talk. While your character talking isn't new to the series, your character talking to someone other than themselves is new. Another new thing is that when you walk past people, they will give background chatter, and almost immediately they will talk about the events from the first two games. So it's very obvious that the people in town are aware that Diablo was real, and what happened in the first game really did happen. So why doesn't she believe Cain? It just doesn't make sense to me, and maybe if I read the book that was published the same day as Diablo 3 was released, I'd understand her motivations more, but I doubt it. I think this might have to do with too many cooks in the kitchen, and someone thought that Cain should be seen as an invalid, but it's just weird. It's also not the first instance of the pre-established lore outright changing to make Diablo 3's story more interesting. We eventually find out that the Wanderer is actually named Aiden, and he was King Leoric's son. Like, I can say definitively that he wasn't. That's very clear from the story and his interactions with the townspeople from the first game. But he is the king's son now.
Aiden came to me last night.
Changing this fundamental piece of story really messes with the context of the first game. And it's not that it's disinteresting, it's just not the original story. I find this a weird take, because one thing the story director said in an interview before the game was released, he said this:
on a personal level, it's been really, really rewarding to get back into the Diablo franchise and be able to help develop this story. I've long felt that it's potentially the most interesting franchise we've built.
I mean, the thing is, I think this could have been a side storyline that the boy grew up in Tristram and was the king's illegitimate son or something, and discovering that could have had other repercussions, like he could have been someone's father, who knows, I don't know. But the game acts like everyone knew this was the case the whole time, when they just didn't. Chris Metzen is not a new hire. Chris is, as far as I can understand, the creator of Diablo 1 and 2's storyline. Now, he didn't do it alone, but he can make something that is Diablo without making it try to be Diablo, because that's what he is. He is Picasso in that analogy. However, one man can't do everything, and even if he could, he has to be beholden to his masters. I'm not giving Chris a pass or saying he isn't responsible for this, but there are several things that feel like they have conflicting messages. One thing that happens very early is Cain dies. Cain is as much a part of Diablo as Diablo is, if not more so. And I think his death is pointless. But I don't think it necessarily had to be. Remember, I said in Diablo 2 that all of the original townspeople should have died. They helped kill Diablo the first time, so they were a threat. Cain only survived because he helped the most and deserved the most torture before he was killed. That's powerful storytelling. I could break down the whole scene of Cain dying, and it doesn't make any sense why he would die. When I said it didn't have to be pointless, you could have used it as fuel to drive Leia into a pivotal role, showing that she was the new bearer of the torch and distancing the current story from its predecessors. This doesn't really happen though, because the story ends up stepping all over itself twice. The first is because she doesn't fucking believe Cain.
You do believe me, don't you, Leah?
He gets wasted by a worshiper of one of the lesser evils, and she's like, fucking nerd in your stories. She only ends up believing him when Tyrael, a character from the previous game, comes to fulfill Kane's role. So it doesn't even serve to distance itself from the previous Diablo game. It just kills a beloved character. Tyrael doesn't really hold the mentorship position for long either, being replaced by Leia's mother Adria, another character from a previous game. And by this point, Leia has basically forgotten about Kane.
He's gone now.
His death meant nothing story-wise. You could have had Kane and Leia both be here at the same time. Tell me, what couldn't have happened in Diablo 3's storyline if he survived? I'm not saying I don't like the story. I do. I even think it's the better story of the series, if I'm being honest. But this is a video about how and why Diablo has changed, and because it's a core pillar now, it has to carry the weight of the game on its shoulders, and I have to give you enough information to decide if it does or doesn't. When asked about the death of Kane, previous developers said,
I think it sucks. You know, I love that character too, and you know, it's a shame that they went that way, but you know, I have no real influence or control over any of that, and they're going to do what they want to do, and you know, I was sad to see him go.
And I don't think it brought anything to the series. Actually, if you did think it was somehow profound, or you were really broken up about it, please comment down below, because I just can't see it. I'd like to break from the main storyline, though, to talk about some of the storytelling devices that the team uses, because I think the team uses some better ones than they have in previous installments. Your character has a voice now, when they didn't before. Now, it's debatable whether a character should or should not have voices, but your character did have some lines of dialogue in the second game. They just weren't able to actually interact in the story. And there are also things that this game does that the storytelling of Diablo 2 did not. I mentioned before that in the original Diablo, one of the pillars was great characters, and whether you loved or hated characters in Diablo 2, they were all a bit one-dimensional. Diablo 3 directly attempts to remedy this by bringing all of your characters with you wherever you go. Leia, Tyrael, Hadrig the blacksmith, Shen the jewel crafter, the Templar, the rogue, and the enchantress. While you are off gallivanting about like in Diablo 2, the characters you meet will join you in order to stop the greater evil. This does help bring that original small town Diablo feel that Diablo 2 had lost. One thing that also changed is that you can now talk to people about certain things for a set amount of time instead of just during specific moments. What I mean by that is before, the game was much more reactive to what you were doing. You would talk to each person about each quest you did in Diablo 1 and Diablo 2. But in Diablo 2, each update to a quest would cause people to say a bit more about it. That's great and helps make the world feel more alive, but it also means you're going to miss out on more than half of the dialogue if you don't actively seek it out. I'll use an example of what I mean. When playing Diablo 2, you get a quest, and let's say everyone in town can now talk to you about it. This quest says, go to someplace. So you head out to do that after talking to everyone. When you get to the area the quest mentions, the quest now updates. So it now says find some enemy. This update has now triggered new dialogue for all the characters. And this new dialogue has overwritten all of the previous dialogue, so you can no longer hear those lines anymore. No big deal, because you've already heard them. So you have to go back to town and talk to them again. Great, you did that. Now, you head back and look for the enemy you need to kill. You find him and then kill him. Awesome. The dialogue updates again. Yay. But the thing is, you miss dialogue. That's because for most quests in the game where you have to kill someone, as soon as you find who you need to kill, the quest text changes to say, kill them. And everyone's dialogue updates in that exact moment, which then updates again as soon as you kill them, overwriting the dialogue that just appeared for everyone. This kind of dialogue is going to be the most commonly missed dialogue, even for the most stout lookers for dialogue. Diablo 3 doesn't do this. Diablo 3 gives everyone a list of dialogue they can talk about that will update as the story progresses, but you can talk to them whenever you want within reason. Some things can be missed if you just never talk to anyone, but it's significantly more forgiving than it was in the previous Diablos. This means more story and more character can be delivered to the average player. However, this does make the world less reactive than it was before. There is another addition to the storytelling in the form of journal entries. These are fully voiced bits of lore that can contextualize the world around you when you find a book or you kill a new monster. Diablo has never been so willing to inject its story into the player. You could play Diablo 1 and 2 without knowing virtually anything that's going on. I should know. I played these games as a child, and I had no idea what the hell was going on. What the fuck was the World Stone? Who's Baal? I was older when I first played Diablo 3. I was also in college, and I only ever played the game when I was in my friend's basement. I would bring a little TV that had like a VHS in it. It was very small. It was portable. I brought it by hand. And I also brought this like super old ass fucking router so we could LAN together because the internet sucked at that time. Anyway, needless to say, the story was not my priority while I was doing this. And I still knew it way better than I did 1 or 2. However, this lack of understanding of the story helps to give perspective to how the story can hit in similar ways to different types of people. As you play through the game, the idea of what you're doing is to destroy all of the 7 evils in one fell swoop. You gather up all the souls into a single black soul stone, and you're going to destroy it. Except you're not going to destroy it. Adria is going to use it to turn her daughter Leia into the prime evil, as Leia is the daughter of Aiden when he was possessed by Diablo. Basically, Leia dies. This is the best and worst point of the story. It's the best point because I really liked Leia. I really liked Leia. Really liked Leia. Maybe I liked Leia too much. Maybe Leia was my waifu when I first played this game, and I took comfort in knowing that since Cain had died, she would be safe. However, she wasn't safe. That bitch, Adria, her mother of all people, killed her. I was pissed. I wanted blood. I didn't understand any of the lore. I just wanted Leia back. And when she was taken from me, I felt a connection to the story like I hadn't before. Even though I barely knew the story, I cared for Leia. Now, compare that with someone well-read in the story like I am today. Do I have as high of a devotion to Leia? Not that I'm willing to admit, but I still like her. More than that, though, I feel a connection to Adria. She had helped me kill Diablo the first time, and now she's betraying me, not just me, her daughter, for what? Power? I've killed Diablo twice. How could she still believe in that piece of shit enough to sacrifice her own daughter? I'm still pissed. So, the scene elicits emotions out of multiple spectrums of player for multiple reasons. So, it's a great scene, right? Only if the story helps deliver the catharsis that these emotions require. Leia is dead, and Adria does escape. These are facts of the story. At this moment in time, when the writers have pulled off a miracle and players new and old to the franchise have a united goal, a united understanding of what needs to be done, the game is completely oblivious to it. Disconnected from the player's will, we don't look for a way to save Leia, and we don't try to get revenge on Adria. Listen, I understand logically in my brain that we have to stop Diablo. But emotionally, this is a much less significant goal to me than the other two. In the end, with things higher on my list to do than stopping Diablo, the final act would be fairly lackluster. We also receive insult to injury right after this happens. We get a cutscene where Diablo is using Leia's dead, battered corpse to raid heaven, and what exactly did they think I'd feel during this scene? Oh, it's so badass that these two powerhouses are going head to head. No. For me, I just have a gut-wrenching feeling knowing that Leia means nothing to anyone. Not to Diablo, not to Tyrael, not to her mother, and most importantly, not to the writers. It took away from the last zone, even on a replay when I knew it would happen. You go to beat Diablo, the game ends, and you unlock access to the next higher difficulty. There's no deep and meaningful story here in the final act, the area is smaller than the past few, and it's easy enough. Overall, there's just not that much oomph to the final fight that's supposed to propel you into the endgame. I'm not going to go into meticulous detail about the endgame of the base game either, as no one will really ever play it anymore. but it wasn't fun. It was extremely difficult in an unfulfilling way. The difficulty came from the fact that the balance of the enemies wasn't tuned correctly, where some enemies would instantly kill you and others would be a joke. This also became even harder to deal with because the drop rates on good items was far too low. The previous 2 Diablo games were carried by their ability to make getting gear a satisfying experience, but that's not present in this version of Diablo 3. What you did in Diablo 3 wasn't any different from Diablo 2's endgame in theory, but Diablo 2 there was always a build that was much better than the rest for each class. This means that if you're undergeared, you can make up for it with a better build and push harder content. But the balance pillar ended up tripping all over itself here, because they put such a strain on each build being as strong as every other build. It became very difficult to raise any class out of obscurity when fighting. Even if the balance of D3 was tuned better, you would have hit a wall. Like I said, farming was worthwhile in D2 because it was satisfying to get gear. People ran Andy and Countess over and over again because things dropped often. But Diablo 3 base had awful drop rates. The time investment was terrible. I think realistically the main issue with the base game shows at its core what Diablo is, because truthfully Diablo 1 and 2 were just as hard as Diablo 3 to a degree. The story had actually leveled up in my opinion whether I'd liked it or not. Even with a prominent story it didn't matter, because the stories have always been a background. The class balance has always been ignored. Diablo 3 base, even though I've been critical about it, brought out a lot of new and innovative changes to the series. But it changed the one thing that made the other games Diablo, the drops. The thing is, people like Diablo because it's an ARPG. In fact, a lot of people would call Diablo the ARPG. Now, the story and characters of 3 are good for your first playthrough and can give you strong memories of 3 after only playing it once. But story isn't the reason I had strong memories of Diablo 1 and 2. It's because Diablo has been popular, completely ignoring these aspects of these games. The 3 pillars really ended up tripping all over themselves, and the game would end up being very disconnected from its previous installments. And even if you completely disagree with me about that, you can't deny that about a year into this game's life cycle, it seemed like Diablo as a series was in a lot of trouble. So it's good that arguably the best Diablo game of all time was just around the corner. When you have a sequel, there are aspects that go from release to release that help cement why a game is the way it is. Some games like Pokemon have more Pokemon, better battles, and so on. Some games have the same areas but different enemy types. Some sequels deconstruct the very essence of the series they're in, and create a new experience that is so much deeper rooted in the core aspects of that series than any of the original games before it could have been. And that sequel requires a 2+ hour retrospective just to talk about how right they got it. How long is this retrospective again? Cutting through all the bullshit, Reaper of Souls came out like a fucking hurricane and absolutely decimated the steaming pile that was Diablo 3 base. While I said I wasn't going to say any one Diablo was better than another, I don't think it's controversial to say that the expansion of a game is better than the game without the expansion. However, with this expansion came many improvements to Diablo 3 overall. The first was in the dev cycle. I spent a good deal of time talking about how the dev cycle of Diablo 3 base was likely a big issue for how it ended up. Whereas before, you had a group of 4,000 novices working on a project they had very little understanding of, you now have 4,000 seasoned developers working on a project they're intricately aware of. This also is accompanied by 2 years of feedback from very, very invested Diablo fans. This is technically the most recent numbered release of Diablo as of posting this video. And it means the most to the series, as most people who have played Diablo have played this version of Diablo. With about 30 million sales, this game is the Diablo that statistically speaking, everyone thinks of when they hear Diablo. The changes they made in the expansion aren't immediately apparent, in the sense that if you pick up Reaper of Souls without ever playing the base game, the initial storyline of the game is exactly the same as it was in the base game. And gear never really became important, even in the base game, until you reach the higher levels of difficulty. If you've beaten Diablo 3's base game though, you would have seen a level cap raised and a new act get added. Don't let that fool you into thinking nothing has changed, because most, if not all of the systems in the base game have been replaced with Reaper of Souls systems. However, Reaper of Souls does add on story in its new act, and you will experience it before experiencing any of the new systems of the game. Even in story though, the difference are made apparent immediately, and the comparisons we can make between the stories of the new act and the base/original game are telling to what the expansion will be like. While the first 2 games weren't as story heavy as the third, they always focused on Diablo and his schemes. Little schemer. This new act is the first one not to do that, and that immediately breaks Reaper of Souls away from the base game, and it's completely shedded the first pillar of the base game, trying to be a Diablo game. I attribute this decision as the single most important thing that led to Reaper of Souls' success. Reaper of Souls is a Diablo game, its own new Diablo game. It's not a copy, it's not an amalgamation, it's a new game entirely while never not feeling like Diablo. An area that has only ever been mentioned in passing, West March, is the location of the final act. It's an area that's existed since the first game. It's just never been explored. It's like the devs are telling us this game explores new territory both in story and in systems, instead of just going back to Tristram for a 4th time. I will say I personally think that the new story isn't as strong as the base story, but it's close. And it only had 1 act to convince me, whereas the base game had 4 and several characters from the first 2 games to help drive it. In the new story, there are only 2 recurring characters that are pivotal to the plot. So the story of Reaper of Souls had to stand on its own merits, while the base game stood on the back of its previous 2 installments. Even saying that though, I think it's a happy accident, because I honestly think Reaper of Souls didn't care about the story the same way the base game did, and the fact that it was nowhere near as important enough to be a core pillar of the experience. In fact, not only do I think Reaper of Souls doesn't care about its main storyline, I would even go as far as to say Reaper of Souls cares less about the storyline than any other Diablo game that's come before it. In fact, it's very possible you've only played the Reaper of storyline once ever. That's because Reaper of Souls has removed the need to replay the storyline of the game more than once. We'll talk more about that later though. One thing they did do is, while they significantly reduced the focus on the story, they vastly improved the way at which the story is delivered to the player. The story unfolds in a much more fulfilling manner. You get side quests for the members of your caravan, letting you learn more about the characters you're with. You get more of a sense of who these people are that you've been traveling with in a single act than you did in the entire base game. You also get a lot of environmental input. The characters surrounding the camp have arcs, and you have no need to interact with, but absolutely can if you want to. You can see a money-grubbing weasel of a man lose out on everything because of that greed. You can see a psychologically scarred mother who isn't able to deal with her children's death, as well as a disgraced soldier who turned tail to desert when things got bad, but couldn't turn his back on the civilians when they were right in front of him. These are some of the many aspects of the game that lead to the core pillar of the new expansion. The journey means more than the destination. The story, gameplay, and endgame all completely meld with this core pillar. The entirety of this expansion is weighted at least partially on top of this pillar. And if I'm going to be honest, the Diablo series as a whole is as well. Whether it's getting to level 99 doing 4 weeks of bail runs, or starting your 15th warrior to head into the cathedral all over again, this series has always been about the journey. It's just that Reaper of Souls is the first game to truly unabashedly care about the journey with little to no regard to the destination. Fighting the final boss Malthael is fun, but it's not mechanically challenging, and it's not really emotional either. If you want to talk about mechanically challenging, that title for me probably goes to Diablo 2's initial Act 4 Diablo fight. He's really difficult and you're not really equipped to fight him at the time. It took me for fucking ever. If you're an old school player, Hell Mode Nilithok before he got nerfed was just If you want to talk about the most emotionally satisfying fight, I would say that for me, it was killing that fucking bitch Adria. It gave me a great deal of satisfaction to fucking strangle the life out of her when the fucking base game left me with the worst case of blue balls I've ever had. So, so you'd have a hard time making the final fight against Malthael stand out among the backdrop of the rest of the game. And Adria wouldn't make sense to be the final boss, so I think they did a really good job. he was only ever going to be just another step on the ladder to get to the next thing, and if they had done anything else, it wouldn't have been as good. Malthael ends up only standing in as a gatekeeper for the endgame activities of Reaper of Souls. It's good that they decided to not take him and blow him up to be more than he needed to be. He served his purpose well, and I really like that. And to be clear, I think it does hurt the story to have a weak final boss, but again, the story isn't what mattered here. It was the game. It's very different than Diablo 3 base. Diablo 3 base just kind of did what Diablo 2 did again. Diablo 3 base had multiple difficulties and it even had uber bosses. The uber bosses were just basically a callback to Diablo 2's uber bosses and weren't anything special. The endgame of Reaper of Souls is noticeably different from any previous installments as well, but at the same time, it's more Diablo than anything that came before it. At the beginning of this section, I talked about needing a 2+ hour retrospective to see why Reaper of Souls is potentially more Diablo than any Diablo game before it, and you've experienced most of that retro. So, I've hopefully equipped you with the knowledge and understanding to talk about this now. Reaper of Souls endgame is pure, distilled Diablo. There's only one goal that matters, getting stronger. And to talk about, it's hard to begin anywhere, because there isn't really a beginning. Once you beat the game, you unlock Adventure Mode, and this mode is, at a glance, what beating Diablo 2 was. Once you beat Hell Mode in Diablo 2, you had free roam to go anywhere. You could go to fight the final boss of the entire game, Baal, or you could go to a specific dungeon in Act 1 and farm a mini-boss to get runes. The entire game and all of its enemies are at your fingertips, and in Reaper of Souls, that's what the endgame is now. There's a difference though, and it helps immensely with the playability and progress. You can play any difficulty you want, at any time you want to play it. There are a few beginning difficulties, easy, normal, hard, and master. But then there's another difficulty called Torment, and Torment has 14 different levels, and you can go to any one you want at any time. No climbing your way through every boss, no sitting through every cutscene. Once you unlock Adventure, you can jump to Torment 14 and get your ass handed to you by every skeleton in Act 1. There's no wait. The issue would seem to be that gear that drops from Torment 1 is just as good as Torment 14. It would seem like this is a big issue at first glance, because how could you possibly fight enemies from Torment 14 with gear from Torment 1, especially when the enemies from Torment 14 deal 163 times more damage and have 1,665 times more health? How can you possibly compete? And why would you? Why would I kill one enemy that's as strong as 200 of the same enemy? Well, first, because he's 81 times as likely to drop a legendary. That's pretty ridiculous, huh? But okay, he's basically unkillable, right? One enemy has almost 2,000 times more health than another enemy, and he drops the same stuff. Why would I spend an hour fighting something? What's the point? Well, this is me on Torment 14 difficulty. Does it look like they're unkillable? Yes. These enemies have way more HP and they do way more damage. But it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. In the very beginning of your foray into the endgame, you'll be more like this. The goal is to just get stronger. It's not to be at Torment 14, it's to get to Torment 2. Remember, the gear is the same, and honestly, it's brilliant game design. Because you're not leveling up just to get gear that you'll replace at a higher difficulty. That's not what Diablo is. It's about getting gear you like and want. It's about feeling amazing when you finally get the piece you've been looking for. It's about the K that represents 1,000 on your damage turning into an M, then into a B, finally popping up as a T every now and again. You go from doing hundreds of thousands of damage to doing trillions of damage. And to put it simply, not one point of damage is ever wasted. This gear I have on is called the Trazul's Avatar set. It's the best set in the game for a Necromancer, and the first piece I got for it randomly dropped from an enemy in Torment 1, and I'm still wearing that exact same piece in Torment 14. Everything you do matters in a way it never has before. In Diablo 2, when you beat Baal on normal the first time, you might have gotten something. Maybe, unlikely though. Maybe you got a good rune from killing Countess on your way up through Nightmare, but probably not. You probably would have had to farm all of these enemies a lot of times just to get a better piece. Once you had that piece, you could then equip it, go on to kill the next stronger people you could, farming them until you could replace that piece with an even better piece, so you could finally farm for the best piece. This is definitely satisfying in its own way, but I want you to think about what I talked about in Diablo 2. Contrast what I was just talking about with the Burr rune I got to drop in the Den of Evil. That Burr rune was still sitting comfortably in my chest as I killed D-Clone. And it was a great feeling. I am ungodly lucky that I got that rune. I'm one in a million people who will ever feel that experience in Diablo 2. However, I'm one in one who will feel that exact same feeling in Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls. Every piece matters. Every item can be used forever. And what you're really playing for is to find each piece faster, not find a better piece. It's about getting exponentially stronger when it's exponentially harder to get stronger, but doing that in a linear way. Making the drop rates exponentially higher on difficulties that are exponentially harder makes a player feel like they're exponentially better, giving them exponentially more fun in non-exponential time. That's actually crazy. I mean, did you hear how many times I said exponentially? Now, it's easier to get stronger today than it was initially. That's obvious. Kanai's Cube has made it much easier to get geared much faster without relying on drop rates alone. And with the nature of Reaper of Souls and its seasonal release, there might be a retrospective out there that can go into detail just on the changes this game made to itself over time. But this isn't that retro. But even at the release of this expansion, gear felt great, and there were still many ways to get it. I'm not going to talk much about rifts, challenges, paragon, bounties, or other specific mechanics. If that's why you watch this video, I'm so sorry. We're not going to go super into depth on them. They're all great additions to the game that I could spend another hour talking about and how fun they are, or how cool they are, but there's a reason I'm not. There are amazing ways to enjoy the Diablo experience, but the Diablo experience is not any one of these mechanics. It's all of them coming together to be one game. I've mentioned farming Countess, but I haven't gone into detail about it. I've mentioned leveling up to 99 through bail runs, but I didn't critique the grind. That's because these are specific experiences to those specific games, but they aren't necessary to having the Diablo experience. When I think about the Diablo experience, I think about something David Brevik said. He talked a lot about D&D and its influence on creating Diablo. What influenced him the most and what he most wanted to replicate in the initial Diablo game, it wasn't the companionship of his fellow D&Ders, it wasn't the role-playing, and it wasn't even the fights. It was the gear. Getting gear was what he loved about D&D, and it's what he wanted to bring to Diablo. I think Reaper of Souls is this idea, this dream of his, and it's in its purest form here. The sound when a legendary or set piece drops, the beam of light that comes out of the piece, the immense excitement you get when you finally get the piece you were looking for, that power you feel, jumping up several difficulties to fight things that are 20 times stronger than what you were just fighting because of the one piece that you just got. This is kind of the drive behind Diablo, and I think everyone who's played it can at least appreciate that. With that said, the Reaper of Souls team had an amazing understanding of Diablo and its strength. I can't even imagine what could possibly happen that could derail the stunning success and goodwill that Reaper of Souls has brought to us.
Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Believe it or not, I started the script for this video almost 2 months ago. I had planned on doing a critique of Diablo Immortal specifically. I had played every Diablo game throughout my life and enjoyed them all. I had been turned off from Diablo Immortal when I heard how pay to win it was, but I ended up buying a new phone around the time it came out. And as a gamer, I wanted some cool game to play on my phone to test it out. So I played Diablo Immortal. I ended up liking it and wanting to do a critique about it. 7 pages into my original script, I had done nothing but talk about the original Diablo games, and I figured, fuck it, might as well play them all again. It gave me a much deeper meaning of what Diablo Immortal is. And most importantly, it turned 7 pages into almost 50 pages. My God, what have I done? So, Diablo Immortal, where the fuck do I begin with this game? It's really getting harder and harder to find a starting point for these games. Diablo 1 had a 1-year dev cycle, but the creator came up with the name for the game back in the 80s, almost 15 years before the game's development began. Diablo 2's was pretty easy, as the idea hadn't changed hands, and Diablo 2 had most of the same devs. Diablo 3 was much harder than 2, because of all the changes of hands. I mean, it was even supposed to be an MMO at one point. And should I talk about Reaper of Souls or Base and Reaper? I mean, we know what I decided, but these are the kinds of things you have to think about when you're choosing when and where to talk about a game. Immortal is in a similar predicament. It's tough because it's the first offshoot, and there are really 3 key points in its history: the announcement, the media backlash, and the release. So I decided I have to talk about the announcement. I just have to. It's important. So I'm going to level with you about this section because Immortal is going to have the most visceral reaction out of all of them. There will be praise for this game. There's a lot of good about this game, and I did enjoy playing it for a time. I was going to make a video because of how much I liked it, so understand that I have to give it praise because it's the truth. No matter what I feel now, I had a time where I really enjoyed the game, and it's incredibly important to talk about this before I take the biggest shit I can on the game. That's because I played the game after not playing any Diablo games for a very long time, and I played the game after playing every single Diablo game back to back, and both opinions are equally valid. I know I said I won't talk about one game over any other, and I won't, but I'm going to talk about the fucking choices they made to squeeze every last dime out of people at the detriment of the game. Anyways, on to the announcement. Diablo Immortal released on June 2nd, 2022, but that's not when the hate for this game started. That was almost 4 years earlier, at BlizzCon 2018. I can even tell you down to the minute when the hate for this game started. It was 12:58 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, November 2nd, 2018. I was actually there when it happened. When I say there, what I mean is that I purchased a virtual ticket and watched it alongside with a large viewing party. So I wasn't technically there. Who was in my viewing party, you ask? It was my 4 World of Warcraft Funko Pops, Deathwing, Illidan, Arthas, and Sylvanas. Me and the boys. And, the token lesbian girl. This is a picture I took to commemorate the day. It was actually very nice. I liked it. I say this because I want you to know that I watched everything that happened at BlizzCon go down in real time, so this is actually a first-hand account. When the game was announced, a lot of outlets were reporting that the hate for Diablo Immortal was because gamers were mad it was a mobile game, but that's not right. It was at 12:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or is it Pacific Daylight Time? I don't know. This is when Diablo Immortal was announced to applause. It's easy to forget because it was such a small time period, but for 43 minutes, people were excited for Diablo Immortal. Everything the developers said had cheers and laughter coming from the crowd. The game was not dead on arrival. People were willing to accept a Diablo mobile experience. Even before the game was released, the devs were abundantly clear that Diablo Immortal would be a mobile experience as well. So the people who were cheering, which was almost all of the people in attendance, knew it was a mobile game. When I was rewatching the Diablo Immortal announcement panels for this video, it actually had me laughing because the devs on stage were adding mobile to the front of things in order to describe things that would be weird to describe as mobile. So what changed? What changed the perception of this game was the answer to this man's question. This guy starts his question off by saying Diablo Immortal has things in it Diablo 3 players have been begging for, meaning he's not only played Diablo 3, he's not only liked Diablo 3, he has also been active enough in the community to know what other players want, and he paid close enough attention to this release announcement from the audience to pick up on desperately desired features that this new game had. Look at this guy's face. He looks so pained when he asks if there will ever be a PC version. He even gave the devs a huge out. He says,
is there any plans to make this playable on PC, or is this just strictly mobile forever?
That leaves a lot of wiggle room for the devs to say anything besides what they said.
Do you guys not have phones?
It's when the devs answered this question, Diablo Immortal became one of the most hated games in history, and Blizzard really started to lose all of the goodwill that Reaper of Souls had brought. You have the famous out-of-season April Fool's joke, you have a lot of upset devs and pissed off fans, but this question, how it was asked and how it was answered, was the beginning of the end of Diablo Immortal's chances with the public. It's the first time you hear any boos, and it was the first of many. The disregard to the fans who wanted to play this game by making it not accessible on PC was idiotic. What I need you to understand, though, if you think I'm being unreasonable here, most, if not every single fan of Diablo has decent PCs that can be used to play games. Obviously, that's why they came to BlizzCon. Even if by some weird circumstances they came to BlizzCon only because they ever played Hearthstone on their phone, that didn't mean they could play Diablo Immortal as well. Before playing Diablo Immortal, I owned a phone I had bought a few years ago so that I could play Pokemon Go. That phone I bought for Pokemon Go could still play Hearthstone with no issues at all when I replaced it. Yet it had no chance of playing Diablo Immortal, and that's the same phone I had when they announced Diablo Immortal. So the question, don't you have phones, is literally just grandstanding, and everyone knew it without necessarily being able to give an on-demand reason why. You need a very, very expensive and high quality phone to be able to play this game. This is the reality of that day. The devs were saying good things about the game, but this one stupid answer that didn't end up even being true destroyed the reputation of the game 4 years before it was released. No Diablo game had this kind of backlash before. While Reaper of Souls showed us that any Diablo game can overcome a bad release, Immortal was still 4 years out from the release, and they were already having major issues. Forget that it was announced that it would also be on PC. When I texted my best friend, someone I played Diablo 1, 2, and 3 with, if he was gonna play, he said he doesn't like playing mobile games. When I asked him if he knew it was gonna be on PC, it turned out he didn't. He didn't even know it was going to be on PC a month after its release. Now, this wasn't the only issue Diablo Immortal had before its release either, but it amplified every other issue that would happen, so it needed to be addressed first. I want to try and reclaim this moment a little bit before moving on, because it's a fucking heated moment. My blood boiled when I saw it 4 years ago, and it boiled when I watched it again, even knowing it's untrue. However, it is untrue. While I played this game a lot on my phone, I played it more on my PC. So the devs did listen, and I'm going to give them the benefit of this one. Rewatching it, it's very clear the dev talking was super nervous to be up on stage.
For those of you who are here at BlizzCon, thank you. We are gonna have, we welcome you here to BlizzCon.
And like I said, it was years before the release. I wanted to talk about this announcement because it's very important to be aware of this before moving on. Otherwise, you'd think I was ignoring very real frustrations the fans and possibly even you sitting there still have from that day. And I want to say, if my best friend didn't know it was on PC, I guarantee you someone who's listening to this video right now just found out about it being on PC. I want you all to know that not only do I understand the frustrations you may have felt in this moment, I felt them too. So try to have an open mind about what I'm going to be talking about because it comes from someone whose background gave them every reason to want to hate this game. The second moment of this game came when the beta released. Articles about how it would cost something like $100 to $500K to fully max out a character. Videos of someone spending over $10,000 on one item just to say the game sucks and then delete their account. I'm not going to disagree with any of them because it doesn't matter, but I'm going to be upfront with you. I spent money on the game. I did it so I could see what it was like when I decided to make a video. I'm also going to level with you because I think a lot of people who spent money on this game don't say this, that I can claim that money I spent on this game on my taxes because it's a cost associated with this YouTube channel and the creation of this video. What does that mean? It means that the person who spent over $10,000 can do the exact same thing. I'm not saying they did, but they can. Not only that, he can also request a refund on the money he spent, so he can get it all back. Also, his following grew when he did this. What does that mean in layman's terms? It means that the $10K he spent, he likely reclaimed. He got even more money from claiming it on taxes. Yes, just because he refunded the money doesn't mean he can't still claim it on his taxes. It's considered a loss, so he still gets the benefit of using the $10,000 on his taxes and holding the $10,000. This is how you hear stories about billionaires who paid nothing in taxes. Not only did that stunt open up a way for him to pay less taxes at no cost to himself, he gained money from an increased following. He had every reason to do what he did. It's not an objective look at what's happening in the game. Right now, I can fire up Diablo Immortal and spend less than $500 and get the item he got with 100% probability easily. And anyone who plays the game enough can also do that. It's not some hidden way of doing it either. It's just buying it on the marketplace. That's not an endorsement or forgiveness. It's still $500, but it's not $10,000. These systems are there. It's an explanation of how the sensational information surrounding Diablo Immortal has been absolute horseshit, because it was much more popular to hate the game sensationally than giving it a fair shake. Just because I can go out and find some car repairman who will rip me off and force me to spend $25,000 on maintenance that I don't need doesn't mean that repairmen are evil. It means I'm a fucking idiot. Unless I claim that $25,000 on my taxes, claim that payment as fraud at my bank and get the money refunded, then I'm a businessman. All right, with those two items out of the way, let's talk about Diablo Immortal. Starting, as always, with the character creation, we see a major difference between previous Diablo games and this one. While you can select your class and character, you can now heavily edit your character's looks. This is immediately counter to what the devs had in mind originally when creating Diablo's character creation. But without getting too nitpicky yet, I do like being able to customize my character. There are a lot of options to work with, but it does take quite a while to get into the game. It basically removes this installment from the quick action that Diablo had originally gone for and replaced it with the standard RPG character creation. Once you begin with whatever your selected class is, you enter Wortham, a town being ransacked by cultists. The mayor has asked for help to fight them off, and you're here to be that help. Before bringing too much attention to the story, I want to talk about the gameplay. It's a lot of fun. There's very little when it comes to the movement of the character and the sound effects that isn't enjoyable. This part of Diablo Immortal is extremely fun. This is the part of the game that I enjoy. If you took how this game feels to control by itself and made the game based around that, I think the game would be phenomenal. One thing you'll notice is that there are only 5 skills you can use, 1 primary and 4 sub-skills. This is a huge dumbing down of the gameplay. If you thought Diablo 3 was dumbed down, then the combat here is like a redneck, I got abducted by aliens and probed level of dumbing down of the combat. The combat gets a little more in-depth for itself with something called essences. These are similar to runes, but more limited. So the way it works is you have 6 main types of legendaries: helmet, chest, shoulders, pants, main hand, and offhand. As of right now, there are 11 different legendaries per type per class. So each class has 66 total legendaries. These different legendaries have a legendary skill that can be turned into an essence. This is going to be a little difficult, so stick with me here. The essences of the legendaries you dismantled, right, can be used to turn other legendaries into the legendary of the essence you have. Let's say you have legendary A, you turn it into an essence. Then you get legendary B. You can use the essence of A to turn B into A. Why would you do that? That's because each legendary has its own legendary skill. And each legendary skill will augment an ability to do something different than it originally did. Kind of like runes did in Diablo 3. If I'm talking about possibilities, there are still a decent amount, but there's really a caveat to the number of possibilities. For the Necromancer, as of right now, the total number of possibilities are 1,753,845,390. That's with 12 skills, 2 primary attacks, and 66 essences broken up into groups of 11 per piece of gear. The thing is, most of the possibilities are garbage. The reason I say that is because each essence augments only 1 ability. For example, there are a total of 6 essences for the skill Command Skeleton. That means that there are likely 10 or 20 million possibilities where you aren't using Command Skeleton, but you are using one of those essences that is just being wasted. These possibilities are objectively worse than another where those essences are replaced by an essence with some capabilities. Even without this, though, you already had 1/4000th the amount of possibilities Diablo 3 had, with no reason to ever use most of the ones that you have. This is going to be a little controversial, but I think this is the reason the game ends up feeling very fun to play. When they limit the capabilities of characters to such a degree, it's much easier to make them fun to play. It goes back to the balance they were trying for in Diablo 3 base. They tried to make all of the options equally balanced, but this game doesn't try to balance all builds. Instead, it tries to shoehorn you into specific builds with the essences that they end up balancing. I'm going to skip along through the story because, to be honest, there's very little there to note. It's really just kind of fan service trip through memory lane, so it's good, it's just not great. You see a lot of characters from Diablo 2, and you're kind of running around from place to place looking for world shards. I didn't dislike the story, but everything happens as you would expect and nothing is at stake because it's a prequel. So you beat the game and it's gearing time. I remember at this point in time when I was playing it originally that they really distilled down the true Diablo experience to the most basic details and gave it to us. I was wrong. It was an enjoyable game that absolutely is worth a play, but it's only good to beat the game and then delete it. The best thing I can say about Diablo Immortal is this. When I played Diablo Immortal, I was furious at all the negative press the game gets. In fact, I still am, but for a different reason. After playing hundreds of hours, I don't think even 1/10 of what I've heard about it is true. I played the game, I liked the game, and virtually every bad thing you've heard about it is either an outright lie or completely overblown. It's insane. When I was first playing the game, I was having such a good time in it. That right there is my pitch. Play, don't spend a fucking dime, and after you beat the final boss, delete it. That section of the game is worth it. It's after that, the entire thing falls apart. All right, positivity over. Time to rip the game apart. I said that only 1/10 of what you heard in the game is right. That's because there's so much wrong that the fucking hate train ignores. If I were to explain what Diablo Immortal is, it would be as follows. Think about all the negative shit I was saying about Diablo 3 base game. All that crap that went wrong with it. Now let's say we went to an alternate dimension and instead of an amazing expansion we got through Reaper of Souls, there was a team that doubled and tripled down on all of the mistakes that Diablo 3 base made and went even further with them. That's what Diablo is. It's some alternate universe Diablo game where the Reaper of Souls expansion never existed, and everything that made Diablo 3 do poorly was cranked up to 11. First of all, I want to talk about microtransactions. This is the 1/10 of the shit you hear about. They are bad, but not nearly as bad as what people make it out to be. Don't get me wrong, they're awful. The numbers you've seen floating around are really high though. You can likely get a max level character for under 50 grand.
And like I said, at this point, I've probably spent about $62,000 to $63,000. I believe it's $63,000 total. I have it all written down. And right now, invested in my account, we have another $10,000. So basically, we are at $73,000 total spent to get where we are. $63,000 to get where we are. $73,000 as far as we got 10 more thousand to spend to rank up these gems.
Now, that's a lot, an insane amount even. I'm not saying it isn't, but it's not the 500 grand that people have been saying. The only thing that's really, really important about these numbers is spending is exponential for linear growth. What that means is that someone who spends $0 can definitely beat someone who spent $300. Someone who spent $300 can beat someone who spent $3,000. Someone who spent $3,000 can beat someone who spent $30,000. The buff buying things gives you is much smaller the more you spend, and it's truly better to spend no money at all. This is a truth of the microtransactions in the game. It doesn't cost nearly as much to upgrade as most places say, and it doesn't cost anything to be competitive. Money does matter. I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just less pay to win than it is to pay to get fucking scammed. How do I know? Because I've spent money and I beat people who told me they spent $30,000 plus when I spent less than a 20th of what they spent. I've also seen the person that I kicked their ass go on to kick another person's ass who had a max power character. And that other person told me they spent over 50 grand. Money is a crutch, and less skilled players can get knocked off their asses no matter how much they've used. It's actually one of the aspects of the game I like the most. There's nothing better than making someone who spent more on this game than I have in my life's savings lick my fucking boot and get so pissed off they spend another 5 grand to power up just to get stomped by me again. So if microtransactions don't deserve the most criticism, then what does? There's one thing that deserves absolutely the most criticism by far, but I have to talk about something else first. The first shot I'll discuss is the lack of content. Now, there isn't much to do in this game besides level up. Diablo Immortal is the first game based on a shared world experience. It's kind of main focus of the game. Long story short, there are 2 factions, the Immortals and the Shadows. These factions consist of groups of players called clans. Clans have about 100 people in them at max. The Shadows are every clan not in the Immortals, and the Immortals are just the best Shadows. Every once in a while, the shadows fight the immortals to become immortals. If the immortals lose the fight, then the shadows fight amongst each other to become the next immortals. As you would expect, this is a very big spender-friendly system. But money isn't all that matters. In fact, politics is the main decider of who the immortals are. The immortal clan that wins can choose 2 other shadow clans to join them to become immortals, and the cycle starts over again, where every non-immortal clan is a fresh shadow clan. This is a very basic summary of the endgame dynamics, but I think it gets the gist across. So what's the issue? Well, everyone obviously wants to be immortal, but being an immortal sucks. Also, being a shadow sucks. But at least you have the drive to be an immortal still. So why does it suck? That's because even on the worst servers ever, where the server's practically dead, there's like 1 immortal for every 10 shadows. So on any event where the 2 factions interact against each other, all of the immortals need to participate or they get destroyed. So being an immortal is very much like a job. Also, you get shit pay for that job. There's almost nothing to gain by being an immortal. As for the shadows, you have less to do, and thereby less to gain. You don't get many activities at all, and it really doesn't matter if you do them, because unless you're really strong, usually only the strongest people are the immortals. So what happens after a while is a strong batch of immortals will take up the title, keep the title for weeks. Shadows will end up quitting because the immortals are bullshit strong, and the immortals will quit because the immortals are bullshit strong, and they'll never be able to go back to being shadows and have fun again. This is the basic loop of the game. This is what there is to strive for. This is the goal. So having a soulless competition means usually what happens is people who spent like $1,000 or more are the ones who stick around because they're afraid of admitting the money they spent wasn't worth it. The game is still early on in its life, so lack of content isn't unheard of or terrible, but all of the content that is there isn't fun. This loop could be improved upon, but in the end it would never matter because of the main issue of the game. Do you remember how I was throwing praise at Reaper of Souls for how it figured out how to implement that pure experience of what makes a Diablo great? Well, I said this is the alternate version of that, so they did the opposite. They figured out how to destroy the pure experience that makes Diablo great. See, Diablo Immortal makes all gear obsolete every single day, and its drop rates are more ruthless than Diablo 3 bases were. I only mentioned briefly in my Diablo 3 explanations, but there is something called a Paragon level. It's another form of progression, where you can level up over and over again, even after hitting cap level. In Reaper of Souls, what you would do was allocate Paragon points into different skills and power up your character. Diablo Immortal has Paragon levels, but it's the evil alternate universe version, where there's a huge quote-unquote benefit to leveling up your Paragon level. And then every time you level up, better gear will now drop for you. At least that's what it seems like on paper. In reality, what that means is that every single time you level up, you theoretically make the max Paragon level piece of capped stat gear from a previous Paragon level obsolete, because something better can now drop. There is also a server Paragon that keeps the vast majority of players around the same Paragon level. So in practice, what happens is you farm endlessly hoping to get a decent roll on your gear, only to know that whatever piece you get today can get replaced before the end of the day. Or because the drop rates are so trash, not for a month or two. And I mean, this is the main issue with the game. It's why I said you shouldn't play the endgame. At the core of every Diablo game is its gear system. It's about making pieces of gear matter, about getting stronger. Diablo Immortal has absolutely decimated that core pillar of the entire franchise. There's only one core pillar of Diablo Immortal in my opinion. It's not the gear, it's not the replayability, it's not even money. The core pillar of Diablo Immortal is FOMO, fear of missing out. You gotta farm so you can get gear, so you can play at the highest level, so you can farm so that you can get gear, so that you can play at the highest level, so that you can farm, so that you can get gear, so that you can play at the highest level, and on and on and on. Battle passes, events with unique items, even higher Paragon levels, special gear drops, low drop rates, etc. FOMO is the main drive of everything you will do in Diablo Immortal, and to be honest, it's really not Diablo in any meaningful way.
Finally, the 2 biggest issues of the game are likely the 2 most integrated with the game's core features. I mentioned earlier that money isn't the biggest factor in terms of strength, and while I truly believe that, I haven't lambasted the game's actual pay-to-win feature yet. The real pay-to-win feature is called resonance. I'm not going to go into exactly how to get resonance, but understand that rapid growth is only achievable by paying a lot of money. Basically, every 1,000 resonance is 50% increased base attributes, with a fully maxed character having over 350% increased base stats. Holy shit, Angel. How can you possibly think that a game is not that bad when you can get 3.5 times more power with money? Well, 2 reasons, and I've kind of already talked about them. The first is that money only lets it grow rapidly. As time goes on, most free-to-play players can easily achieve higher and higher values of resonance. The game has almost been out for 6 months, and I stopped playing about 2 months ago. But at that point, free-to-play players who were fairly into the game but didn't grind like hell could have easily gotten 1500 reso, or 75% increased stats. I assume at this point, they'd have over 2000 reso. And this is only going to get faster. The other thing is that the market is where you're going to get most of your items, and as the game progresses, the items on the market get cheaper, meaning it gets easier for free-to-play players and pay-to-win players to get stronger. So while it used to cost 70,000 to get as strong as possible, it likely costs half that, which also means it gets easier as time goes on for free-to-play players to get reso. So why am I saying it's an issue? Because it's still pay-to-win, and pay-to-win can eat my ass. Next question. But seriously, I'm not immune to financial strain. $60 for a base game with no pay-to-win features is still a lot of money, even if games are cheaper than they've ever been, especially with current inflation. Please help me, I need eggs. Let alone $500 for barely any strength in some pay-to-win game like Diablo Immortal. The reason I don't find Diablo Immortal's pay-to-win resonance egregious like the rest of the internet is because of how terrible the value of pay-to-win is. And because FOMO is the only core pillar, if you stop paying the same amount, you lose any benefit. And free-to-play will just keep creeping up. $60 doesn't make someone stronger than you if you're free to play. It takes like 2,000, and the longer you both play, the less each dollar they spent is worth. The second issue is, in my opinion, the worst part of Diablo Immortal: combat rating. The system sucks all the fun out of the game. CR is basically a benchmark. If something requires, let's say, 10,000 CR, and you have 9,850 CR, everything would basically one-shot you. If you had 9,975 CR, you wouldn't be one-shot, but you wouldn't be that well off. Enemies would probably hit you 3 times as hard, and you'd only do like 60% of your normal damage. If you had exactly 10k, whatever you're fighting would be exactly the same difficulty as every other thing in the game, which just means mind-numbingly easy. Now, if it was, let's say, 100,000 CR and you had 150 less, it's the same thing. So basically, a benchmark. If it's not immediately apparent why I take issue with this system, it's because CR is based solely on your stats. While it's not exactly one-to-one, for explanation purposes, you could basically say that every stat is like 1 CR. So for every stat point, you gain a CR. Great. Why does that suck? The reason is because Diablo 3 did so amazingly well at making gear an integral part of the playstyle. You would get a few set pieces and then get massive gains because of how you built your character. Let's say you conflated CR and Immortal to damage from D3. You'd think that the higher this damage number, the stronger you are. Well, actually, that's incredibly wrong. With all the gear I have in my stash, I could probably raise my damage by 200,000 to 300,000. And doing so would probably drop me back to struggling in Torment 7 when I can easily do Torment 14. But what is the issue with focusing on stats of gear over the set bonuses of the gear? It's kind of the same thing when you break it down. They could just accurately adjust the damage, right? Well, let's look at the effects of this on my games. This is my stash in D3. It looks like that because different gear combinations at different points in the game's life can give different bonuses, meaning it's a good idea to test and play around with different sets. And it doesn't matter when I play the game, each piece will always be meaningful in some way. This is my inventory in Diablo Immortal. Why isn't there any gear in there? That's because it'd be a waste of fucking space. The difference between a piece of gear that gives 400 CR and another that gives 401 CR, night and day. As long as I get closer to whatever the CR requirement is in the content that I'm doing, I don't care what the piece is. This is what CR and resonance do to the game. When I was playing at the highest level, I was hearing a lot of the top players talking about things that you can do to max out your bonus abilities, picking the right gem to get the best edge over the competition because of its abilities, getting the best set pieces from the dungeon. I was playing at the highest tier of players on my server, and this is all they would talk about. It's what every YouTube video I watched focused on, yet it was pointless. The only thing that matters in PvE is CR, and in PvP, it's reso. I kind of proved this too, because that's all I cared about. I used my money solely to get the cheapest reso I could, and I only equipped pieces that gave me the highest CR, foregoing any set bonuses along the way. What did completely ignoring the systems of the game that every YouTuber and experienced player get me? Everything. I was as strong as people who spent 10 times as much as I did, and I was virtually undefeated in PvP, except against people who had literally maxed out their characters and were also good at the game. And I would have eventually caught up to even them, because it's just a numbers game. And that's the biggest issue with Immortal. And it wasn't just me either. The people I played with, I kept harping on how important CR and Rezo was. They eventually ignored any kind of strategy with gear and just went for CR and Rezo and moved up in the hierarchy of the game. When none of these things on this gear matters, all you end up seeing when you look at gear is this. That's it. Is my CR high enough? Then I'm good in PvP. Can my skill overcome the resonance difference? If so, I'll be fine in PvP. In the final words in the Reaper of Souls sections, I said the creator wanted to bring that fun from D&D's gearing systems, and Reaper of Souls did that very well in my opinion. As for Immortal, these two systems, CR and Rezo, completely removed any joy I got from getting pieces in the game. I said at the beginning of this video I would point out where each game got its motivations, and I had negative things to say about Diablo 3, but pointed out that the dev cycle was the reason. It's easy to point out that Diablo Immortal is a very NetEase game. NetEase is the team that made Diablo Immortal. I don't think that's why Diablo Immortal is what it is, though. NetEase is a Chinese dev that makes the games that they make. If I owned Final Fantasy and I gave people who made Street Fighter the franchise, I would expect a game closer to Dissidia than Final Fantasy X. It would not be their fault that they made a game the way they know how to make it. It's the decision to give this game to them that's the main issue here. Blizzard had multiple games released with different mobile apps. Hearthstone and the mobile app for World of Warcraft, to name a couple. Well, the answer is, funnily enough, Activision. Activision purchased Blizzard back in 2008, and it was that year that Blizzard also decided to partner up with NetEase to publish StarCraft 2 to the Chinese market. They eventually ended up bringing several of their games to China with NetEase, and I would go even further to back up this point by pointing out that now that Blizzard Activision is likely being bought by Microsoft, the NetEase contract is coming to a close. Realistically, though, it's unclear what caused Blizzard to fully commit to the Diablo Immortal game, and it will likely be a couple of years before we find out if they can make a Reaper of Souls-like recovery. Honestly, I think it's possible, but it requires a real deep dive into the series, and a long, hard look at what they can do with the existing monetization system to bring it back from the brink, or if it will be completely overwritten by Diablo 4 when it comes out, but there is always hope. Oh my god, I'm done. This has been my longest video ever. I've been working on this for 4 straight months. I hope you liked it because I loved making it. However, with the completion of this video, I've decided on something. I decided to open a Patreon. I realized I love doing this and I want to do it full time. I don't know if I'll ever be able to. That's up to you, my wings, for sure. But I missed my 1-year anniversary for this channel and I missed New Year's. I'm recording this at 3 a.m. Oh God. And this recording is after the entire video is done. So there's 2 hours and 27 minutes of video completely edited and ready to ship. I'm just recording this as kind of like a message. So this is being recorded the same day that this is going live. I've had a lot of sleepless nights like this in preparation for this video because this has been a beast for me. And if I had less time I needed to commit to work, I could focus more time on my videos. Hence the Patreon. So what reason do you have for becoming a patron of mine? Well, more content, kind of. As of right now, you won't be getting any exclusive content from me. So enticing. But the more people that sub to my Patreon, the closer I'll be to making this a full-time job, and the more content I'll be able to make. I didn't start this channel for money, and I've actually spent every single dollar I've made from this channel on this channel. And I'm not even talking about what I spent on Diablo Immortal. However, if I make this my full-time job, I'll devote my time to making as much high-quality content as I can. And to be frank, this kind of sucks. I don't want to ask you for money. I just want to make content endlessly. I want to make more series retrospectives like Kingdom Hearts or Dragon Age. I want to cover more relevant games like Diablo 4, Final Fantasy 16. And I really want to make another Elden Ring lore video for all the Elden Ring lore fans that sub to my channel. It's just the only way I could put more of myself into the channel is to have more hours in the day. And I guess Patreon is the only thing I could think of. Sorry, anyways, I rambled enough. Thanks again for watching, really. Oh yeah, I'll put a link down below for the Patreon. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, bye-bye. I didn't know where to put this, so I put it at the end. I think Wirt is alive and he and Gillian had a child, Squirt. I know that his corpse is in Diablo 2, but you don't see his corpse in the Darkening of Tristram event. And besides him, only 3 people are missing: Cain, Adria, and Gillian. People who were able to get out of Tristram before they died. So I think Wirt was playing dead in Diablo 2 and he used a bell to escape. He then found Gillian after Cain took Leia, helped her deal with the demons, as he would know better than anyone how to deal with their influence. We know he likes her because he says so in Diablo 1. Some evidence that Squirt is their child is that Squirt is definitely young enough that she was born after Leia left Cain. She says her parents are from Tristan, and finally she's just like Wirt, even having Wirt's bell. So there. Anyway, little Easter egg for any of those who stayed to the end. Bye-bye.